Hello, friends and comrades. Welcome to another Liger-Garrido Power Hour, hosted by the Midwestern Marx Institute for Marxist Theory and Political Analysis. Look at the flex. That's the. You're doing it in almost every TikTok now. At the end, it's the symbol. But today we're going to be talking. The first story is going to be on the AFL-CIO leaders casting of their endorsement for Biden in a somewhat secretive and underhanded form. And we have a long story from our friend Chris Townsend on it, and we'll also discuss after that what the Leninist position should be to those sorts of business or reactionary unions. And then we also have a video that we'll be reacting to. Do you want to speak a little bit about that, Eddie?
Yeah, I've been seeing this video. I've had it recommended by multiple people in the audience, and I've seen it pop up on my suggested videos. It's clearly being pushed by the YouTube algorithm right now, but it's by this Tiki history account, or no, Tick history account. Sorry, like Tick and TikTok. It's called The Cult Many Are In But Don't Realize, and they're going to talk about the cult of dialectical materialism. So Carlos is laughing at that already. I knew it would be a perfect thing for us to react to together. Unfortunately, Noah's not with us tonight. I'm sure he would have loved that too. But yeah, I can't wait to dive into that one and deconstruct it with you.
We'll start right after this. I'm okay, man. I'm okay in the international. That's the golden mix. Dude, I almost didn't make it. I was watching your stream earlier, and you had a segment where you were reacting to Jacob's video on on Jordan Peterson's dream about his girlfriend. Dude, that turned my stomach upside down. I didn't think I was going to make it. What the fuck was that?
I felt like, Jacob's a moderator and a longtime member of the audience. I felt like I couldn't just stop his video partway in between. But when we were in the middle of that, I was like about to throw up. I'm like, I feel like, this video should be taken down off YouTube. This is just repulsive. Like, dude, who hasn't had like a weird dream? But why do you put it in a book? Why do you put it in a book?
There's a meme going around when someone does that, and the archetypical response is that a therapist wouldn't be able to beat this out of me, and it's true. Like, how do you? It's just it's too hard to even comprehend, and I mean it should symbolize maybe the form of disconnect that these people have with just like the regular mental workings of normal working class people, where if they think that adding a story like that to a book is okay, it's just, oh boy.
True. I wonder if some of these pundits do become like socially isolated, like, even with what we do. You don't have like daily interactions with coworkers and stuff. Obviously, you have teaching and studying in a university, and I have wrestling, so we have all these outlets that we get social interaction from. But I can see how it would get lonely, especially if you don't have stuff like that. Jordan Peterson might be in a bad spot. He sure seems like it, the way he's like on Twitter 24/7 fighting for his life.
When you get lonely, grandma's always there for you.
Jeez.
Yeah, it makes you think. Why was the room dirty? Was
Right?
grandma with him? What's the source? What's the material source of the dream? Oh God,
Do dreams have material sources? Is that a Marxist interpretation or belief?
I don't think so. I mean, everything has a material source, and to some extent, the dream is itself a form of materiality. It's occurring in a material brain, um, but yeah, I'm not sure. We got to get a psychoanalyst on. Perhaps they would be the best person to ask that.
For sure. All right, you want to get into our story from Chris Townsend today, which great job with the stream and interview with him the other day, by the way. It was super informative, and it's always fun learning about the party too and what it used to be.
Yeah, and hopefully we're going to stay in contact and see if he's interested in doing at some point a class for the Marxism School on union history and organizing, which I think is going to be terrifically important, especially if the goal of these classes are to train the next generation of leaders of the class struggle. So if someone who's been leading unions for 40 years is able to do that, that would be huge.
For sure, for sure.
But
Um, so I haven't seen this story that you got yet from Chris, but
so top AFL-CIO leaders cast their lot with Biden. The long-term decline and decay of the AFL-CIO as the leading national labor body continues on its decade-long course. The most recent evidence is the extraordinarily early and virtually invisible endorsement of President Joe Biden by Federation leaders for re-election next year in November 2024. Commercial news coverage of the endorsement and campaign event in Philadelphia the next day, designed to whoop up the endorsement, was scant. This big news lies buried in the AFL-CIO website, safe from anyone curious about how or why this happened a full 17 months before the election.
hmm. The Biden endorsement vote took place as part of an AFL-CIO General Board meeting, which includes the Executive Council members, a chief officer of each affiliated union, the trade and industrial departments, constituency groups, allied organizations, and 8 regional representatives of the state federations and central labor councils. No detail has been released, apparently, on exactly who participated in this meeting and who might have been representing. Only the end result mattered, not the details of how the more than 12 million member labor federation arrived at this critical decision. Apologists for the process will claim that it was democratic, but an examination of some facts are in order first.
Right, and it's important to talk about these methods that are employed in the labor movement, and that, as we'll see, they're central to the concretizing of the fissure between the rank and file and the leadership of these unions. And there's certain communist organizations that model their democratic processes within their organizations on these unions, and we should ask how much positive models these business unions operations are. But in an apparent voice note held during the June 16 meeting, there was one, possibly two dissenting votes. No information was released identifying who they were, as the proceedings were carefully jiggered to create an atmosphere of inevitability and unanimity. So fearful of dissent or questioning were the AFL-CIO leaders chairing the meeting that there was not even a roll call vote, which would at least have allowed a member of any of the 60 affiliate unions to find out how their union president had voted. No other candidates were presumably considered, and there was little discussion, debate, or deliberation during the meeting. Any post-meeting postings on the AFL-CIO webpage are tiny and difficult to find, leading one to conclude that since the Biden selection has been accomplished, the entire affair can be quietly buried out of sight.
It's interesting. It's in line too with the AFL-CIO's history. I mean, not the history of their rank and file, of course, but with their bureaucracy. They've often been called the AFL-CIA because of their connections to the establishment, the Democratic Party. So you got to imagine some Democratic Party operatives are pushing this from the top. I mean, that's what it seems like
Yeah.
here.
Right, and it's not like anything's given back to the labor movement, right? At least the old school opportunists, like part of the reason why they sold out was because not only were they able to get cushy jobs and advance their careers, but at least crumbs were given to the labor movement. That was part of the argument that they uh, sell out the working class at home and abroad in the name of getting crumbs that are grounded on the super profits of empire. That's the old Leninist understanding of what the aristocracy of labor, the labor aristocracy is. In this case, there's not even the crumbs. Like the working class is literally not receiving nothing. They're not receiving anything from this very blatant, undemocratic, and somewhat secretive right opportunism and careerism on the part of labor leaders.
Exactly. So continuing on here, it says, owing to the near secret AFL-CIO endorsement process, it is unknown how many unions may have withheld their endorsement or merely remained silent during the voice vote. While several of the unions voting to endorse Biden prior to the June 16th confab made assorted claims that were being taken or that were taking the action. Sorry, that they were taking the action certain that their members supported such action. There was little evidence offered as to how this was done or what the exact results of this polling were. The Machinists Union, or IAM, did undertake a detailed and lengthy process to allow for membership input into its political endorsement process, but the results were not announced until 1 week after the AFL-CIO action. And the statement announcing the endorsement of Biden by IAM President Robert Martinez omitted any reference to Biden's breaking of the rail strike late last year. This convenient whitewash of Biden's shameful anti-union actions will be repeated by most other unions. No criticism will be allowed of Biden under any circumstances. The AFL-CIO endorsement meeting was, after all, a carefully scripted Biden campaign event, not a serious Federation endorsement forum.
That's so important to know because there's communists that still have the audacity to say, yeah, but the labor movement is with Biden. So, Biden is to some extent at least the candidate of the working class. And it's like, well, statistics after statistics come out that, for a time at least, the preferred candidate of many people within the unions was Trump. And, think what you want to think about that. But, um, the fact that the leadership endorsed a candidate that their members were not in line with said something about the democratic or non-democratic workings within the union. And we'll get to this point later on in the segment, but it's what should the position of the communists be? Should it be, well, the leaders of working class unions are with Biden? That means that the working class is with Biden. And if we're socialists, we have to be with the working class, and the working class is with Biden. Therefore, we got to be with Biden. I think very clearly we know that's not the correct process of thinking that a communist should be engaged in, and we'll discuss later on what the correct process would look like. But there was likewise no public discussion of any other course of action. Perhaps a delay in the endorsement to see if other more worthy candidates may emerge. Perhaps a candidate forum to allow newcomers a serious taking of stock of the Federation's sinking political fortunes. Nothing. Such is the solid lock by the Democratic Party and business union mindset on the leaders of the largest labor federation. The time-tested drill where labor leaders responded to the needs of the Democrats, hat in hand, checkbook at the ready, was on full display in the recent meeting. And then we come to wonder why, only like 7% of the working class is organized in unions, and a very small percentage of that seven, itself small percentage is not very active. Only a small percentage is active of that already small 7% of unionized workers. So um, I know the inclination seems to be, let's just build something new, and maybe that works. But We'll see later on how Lenin dealt with similar problems that occurred at his time.
For sure. Townsend says this is nothing new. For many decades, the AFL, just what I said earlier, this is nothing new for the AFL-CIO. For many decades, the AFL-CIO leadership has endorsed and promoted the funding of politicians, mostly Democrats, deep connections to the Democratic establishment, also, like I said earlier, without negotiating any tangible guarantees in return. There also appears here to have been little or no negotiation regarding an unexpected return for Labor's investment should Biden win. The unions and the union vote and endorsement were essential to Biden winning the last election, and it was
Mhm.
the idea that he owed them big time. He was going to pay them back, and obviously that doesn't happen. But it says the business union bargain with the Democrats has been and continues to be a failure of colossal proportions, with each successive election cycle costing labor more and more in cash, footwork, and political credibility. Exactly. This is the main thing with supporting Democrats. People think, why not? They're the lesser of two evils. Well, it costs so much energy and time and resources and labor go into helping this party get elected, and then as Townsend points out here, you get nothing in return, right? They don't follow through on their promises, their guarantees. They've completely abandoned labor since Bill Clinton, at least. Um, with almost 40% of the organized workers in the U.S. belonging to unions not affiliated with the AFL-CIO, there is at least a possibility that an alternative process and path may be followed by some of those unions, although all indications are that the bulk of the unaffiliated unions will likewise endorse Biden at some point using similar methods. So, interesting. It'd be so interesting, too, to see a poll of the rank and file and just see where their heads are at. It would have been interesting the last few years, too, with I know a ton of people, like just in my personal life, a ton of union people who love Bernie. But then
Yeah.
when Bernie wasn't the guy, they went Trump.
The Labor for Bernie guy, one of the leading Labor for Bernie people, that was his thing. He was Bernie in 2016. When he lost, he ended up going with Trump because Trump, of course, had the rhetoric of we're going to bring the jobs back, we're going to bring industry back, a very populist rhetoric, anti-NAFTA at certain points. And those are the people that were affected by their jobs being shipped out of the country so that the capitalists can make more profit on cheap labor abroad. And on other cheaper things such as rents for the places where the stuff would be made, not just cheap labor. So these were the people that were affected. Trump had this rhetoric. They went with Trump, and then Trump did absolutely nothing for them. And then the guy came back and led the Labor for Bernie group. I hate that I forget
I
what
got
his
my
name
Bernie
was.
shirt on. Coincidence.
Um, so I think what you mentioned also from the previous slide, the amount of effort that goes into these election process, money, time, work, labor, just to get a candidate that is guaranteed to stab the working class in the back. It reminds me of I've mentioned it before, but the call-in joke that they do to Theo Vaughn. Someone calls him and says, I paid $1 for 10 chicken nuggets at Wendy's, and then I got diarrhea. He's like, that's not a bargain. That sounds like a risk. We gave them $1 and then you shit yourself. And that's the same thing that's going on here. You're giving them time, you're giving them resources, you're giving them work, you're giving them money that the working class obviously doesn't have, and working class institutions are not just floating in abundance of money, and they're giving it to the Democrats to then have this party, which is an anti-worker, pro-imperialist, fascistic party, just stab the working class in the back.
I'm sorry. The one time my heavyweight in high school ate 100 of those Wendy's chicken nuggets when they were like $1 for 5 or whatever the heck. Shout out to Connor. Oh, is there another slide?
Yeah. That's just the one that I'm reading. But Marius says if Cornel West is going to get anywhere, he has to attract dissident unions. I don't think RFK Jr. or Marianne Williamson is likely to attract much labor support. Neither have strong pro-labor records. Yeah, that is true. That is absolutely true. Um, Townsend says real forward progress for labor and the working class on the political front is no longer even on the AFL-CIO's agenda. And again, here's one of the central differences with old school social chauvinism and right opportunists and labor aristocrats. At least they wanted to somewhat improve the lot of their working class at home, at least by a little bit. Today they're not even asking for anything. They're just full on selling out to the ruling class. Political favors from Democrats and support for small incremental legislation that might slow the rate of union decline compromise the bulk of the Federation's political program. So instead of fighting for something, they're just fighting so that they get like screwed at a lesser rate. So there's nothing to gain. There's just the gain is having a lesser loss. Worse still is the fact of labor's steep overall decline. Worse still, the fact of labor's steep overall decline is not even recognized, leaving politicians like Biden to squeeze more and more precious resources out of the debilitated unions year upon year. So they're taking more resources, and there's less resources each year for the unions because the labor movement is being debilitated. It would be unimaginable for any in the Democratic Party leadership to actually contribute financially to labor's battles and needs, although a case could be made that such support would be in order on need after decades of labor's contributions to the Democrats. The presidential endorsement process of the AFL-CIO has also become a rubber stamping of whoever the leading establishment Democratic candidate may be, not driven in any way by the demands of the membership that today's realities for working people are addressed.
The AFL-CIO decision. I love this popcorn reading, by the way. Tell us who did a better job, who's more fluent in the comments. The AFL-CIO decision to resort to the early endorsement gimmick has also been tried before with disastrous results. In the 1984 presidential election, the Federation was determined to avoid the disastrous humiliation of 1980 when a dozen unions broke ranks and endorsed the arch-reactionary Ronald Reagan. This contributed to the defeat of the hapless Jimmy Carter in the 1980 Reagan landslide. Jimmy Carter is probably one of the better modern presidents, but that's a fair and apt description of him strategically and politically. Nice guy as far as U.S. presidents go. But let's see here. In a frantic effort to promote the market, Walter Mondale, Carter's vice president, as Labor's preferred inside pick in 1984, the AFL-CIO leadership proceeded to orchestrate what was up until then the earliest ever AFL-CIO endorsement. The Federation's leadership at the time believed that if a real debate could be stopped, headed off at the pass, the Labor's pick, Mondale, would naturally proceed without challenge and sweep the Democrats back into office. So very interesting. I imagine that's exactly what they're trying to do with Biden here. Avoid any kind of debate with RFK that goes disastrous and swings thousands of voters. Avoid any kind of debate with Cornel West. Headed off at the beginning, like, yeah, of course, Biden, right? Biden's the obvious choice here. He's, was the Democratic nominee last year. He's the incumbent. We have to support the incumbent, even though RFK is polling as high as 15%. I see some. Never mind. I thought someone in the comments was talking about Real Clear Politics. They were talking about the Revolutionary Communist Party, the Bob Avakian group, which is totally different thing than Real Clear Politics, the polling institute. But yeah, never mind. Sorry.
Townsend says that hoping to avoid any serious debate among union members or the public at large, something that, by the way, the Democratic Party is also avoiding by not having debates, and guarantee a smooth Mondale nomination, the rushed job scheme steadily unraveled when both civil rights leader Jesse Jackson and Colorado Senator Gary Hart both emerged as candidates with large and active followings. Mondale and his campaign faltered badly under the pressure of an actual competitive race, and despite winning the nomination, he was crushed in the 1984 election as Reagan sailed to re-election. AFL-CIO maneuvering to launch Mondale and completely control and dominate the ordinary primary election process was rejected by voters and seen as just another inside job power grab. The 1984 electorate instead sought a freewheeling debate, as the first years of Reagan had shaken the labor establishment and membership alike. I think we're seeing quite similar conditions, and of course that's the point of the of bringing back the story of '84. But we have some progressive candidates, not just now within the Democratic Party, but outside of the Democratic Party. And what we're finding with candidates, for instance, like RFK Jr., is that they're polling, even if they're polling less than Biden, they're polling better than Biden in their battles against Trump. So by trying to push forward Biden as the candidate, they're likely going to end up in the similar condition as Mondale, which is that Biden wins the nomination, but then loses against Trump because he has literally nothing to offer except like leaving interviews midway, as he did earlier today.
As the 1984 election season unfolded, the Republican Reagan coasted to victory in his own primary election. On the Democrat side, the three-way political melee involving Mondale, Hart, and Jackson unfolded. The Democratic Party establishment, with Mondale and the AFL-CIO at its head, all worked furiously to motivate and even browbeat voters who would not support Mondale. But millions of working class voters were well aware of the disastrous policies and missteps of the Carter presidency just a few years earlier, and that Mondale had been his loyal vice president. These efforts to generate a top-down wave for Mondale failed miserably by identifying so closely and uncritically with Mondale. The bulk of the labor leadership merely found themselves out of step with the masses. Masses of voters, as was Mondale himself. Mondale was seen correctly as offering only warmed over leftovers from the Carter years, and voters rejected it.
So basically, he goes on to say that ever since the AFL-CIO did this, they've been basically doing it over and over again. And Townsend concludes by saying that in order to understand the business union leadership and much of its mindset today, it must be recognized that most of the AFL-CIO unions today are dominated by one-person rule, frequently unchallenged rule, and leaders who face few contested elections. The business union ideology that dominates most of the labor unions allows for little serious internal dissent or debate over basic issues. The slip it by in a hurry endorsement of Biden is a reflection of this business union contempt for debate and discussion. And while such business union culture may be, for the time being anyway, what many union members must deal with in their own unions, to try to impose those same methods onto a gigantic national political process like the presidential election process is absurd. Individual union leaders may be able to stifle debate and dissent and control outcomes within a relatively small union setting in spite of the facts. But to imagine that such control might likewise be exercised on a national scale is delusional.
The AFL-CIO business union consensus that Joe Biden is somehow the best candidate, despite his obviously deteriorating physical condition, sinking approval ratings, breaking of the railroad strike, disastrous embrace of war threats, and military expansion as his primary foreign policy tools, and his unholy alliance with the Federal Reserve's attempts to induce a deep recession in the country. None of these factors bode well for Biden's fortunes in the 2024 election. It's an interesting point about the Federal Reserve's attempts to induce a deep recession, because I wonder how much worse things are going to get with inflation, if there's going to be some kind of big crash in the future. I imagine there is, looking at what they did with the Silicon Valley Bank, bailing that out before it crashed, which, Biden officials admitted they tried to keep it hush-hush, and because they didn't want people comparing it to 2008, but they admitted it would have been a total collapse of the financial system if they didn't bail it out. So that's going to have huge election implications if, something goes down similar to the 2008 crisis. So something to keep an eye on for sure.
And even bourgeois papers are predicting that something will go down either sometime late this year or next year. They've been predicting it for a while. They're not stupid. They've read their capital, maybe not, but they know that there's a tendency every 8 to 10 years for the system to just collapse. And they've averted it a couple times. Specifically, the crisis of the pandemic was averted through various means. So they've been expecting that something big is going to hit within the next year or two. So the question is it going to hit before or after the election? Because I think that would, be an influential factor in how the people end up voting.
And will Daddy G bail us out again? I don't think
I don't
so.
think so. Jinx.
Maybe.
So the question now for communists is, well, what do you do? You have a labor movement that is, the closest you can get to inexistent. You have only about 7% of the working class organized in unions, and the AFL is the largest union representing the most workers in the country. Do you say, well, any union related to the AFL-CIO because it's a reactionary bourgeois business union led by labor aristocrats and, what Lenin, Marx, and Engels called bourgeoisified workers, is too impure. We're not going to join it. Just forget about it. And we're going to build our own union on the side. Well, in some cases, that might be the route, such as the Amazon Labor Union that worked on its own. But the communist response is usually go to where the workers are. And if the workers are in organizations where the leaders are not representing their interest, use that. Show them how it is that that's the case. And that's how you're able to develop their consciousness. Either way, unions end up usually functioning as, Lenin calls them schools of communism. And this is even the case when you have this reactionary union where the leadership consistently sides with the bourgeoisie against the working class. You could still use that to your advantage by showing the working class how that's the case. What you should never do is say, I'm not joining this union because it's imperfect. Even if the masses are here, I'm not going to join it. So I have a few quotes from perhaps the best text where he unfolds this idea: left-wing communism and infantile disorder. So I don't know. Do you want me to read through these, Eddie?
Yeah, sure.
Um, he says, and this is of course in his context. He says, we're waging a struggle against the labor aristocracy in the name of the masses of the workers, and in order to win them over to our side. We are waging the struggle against the opportunist and social chauvinist leaders in order to win the working class over to our side. It would be absurd to forget this most elementary and most self evident truth. Yet it is this very absurdity that the German left communists perpetrate when, because of the reactionary and counter revolutionary character of the trade union top leadership, they jump to the conclusion that we must withdraw from the labor unions, from the trade unions, refuse to work in them, and create new and artificial forms of labor organizations. In other words, we must create our own Soviets. This is so unpardonable a blunder that it is tantamount to the greatest service communists could render the bourgeoisie. Like all the opportunist, social chauvinists, and Kautskyite trade union leaders, our Mensheviks are nothing but agents of the bourgeoisie in the working class government, as they were fond of saying, or labor lieutenants of the capitalist class, to use the splendid and profoundly true expression of the followers of Daniel de Leon in America. So there's Lenin quoting R. de Leon, the leader, of course, of the Socialist Labor Party, the first fairly large uh, American Marxist party in the U.S. Of course, it's in the U.S. if it's an American Marxist party. To refuse to work in the reactionary trade unions means leaving the insufficiently developed or backward masses of workers under the influence of the reactionary leaders, the agents of the bourgeoisie, the labor aristocrats, or the workers who have become completely bourgeois, as Engels frequently said. Um, what do you think?
Working within the reactionary trade unions. What do I think about that?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it applies perfectly. It applies perfectly. Like every problem that Lenin and the Bolsheviks were dealing with the trade unions, opportunism, they're being reactionary, them sometimes siding with imperialism, which I mean that's what the Biden endorsement is as well. Um, it's, it's always a temptation for these unions, and if not the rank and file, the bureaucrats, the administrators. So I mean, the key has always been to get to the rank and file,
Yeah.
and to forge connections with the rank and file, and even, show them the flaws in their own union. Show them how they can utilize the union as a tool of political action and class struggle, and to fight for better conditions for themselves. And understand how the unions operate and work, but also show them the flaws, show them how the unions are, siding with imperialism, siding with the neoliberals like Biden. And yeah, I mean, the AFL-CIO's got a long history of this kind of stuff. It's not like it's anything new. And if we look at our leaders' history, they've written on this pretty extensively. So definitely nothing that's surprising, but yeah.
Absolutely, and this applies not just to the DNC tied unions like the AFL-CIO and most of them, frankly, which are tied to the Democratic Party, but also, to the reaction that many communists have about organizing, specifically workers in the Rust Belt that are perhaps more conservative and leaning with their social views and that voted for Trump. This is a section that I have in my book, which I think it's a big mistake, which is that this section of the working class is deemed unorganizable because of their social views. Their social views don't measure up to the enlightened, pure ideals of the PMC or of the liberal part of the Democratic Party affiliated working class. And remember that only 7% of workers are unionized. So that leaves literally 93% of them that are not. And a lot of them are going to have various ideological positions, and we should organize them not on the basis of their ideology, but on the basis of their class. And then be able to work from where they're at ideologically and know how to reorient them towards where we want them to go, which is towards an idea that, the system that we exist in is not eternal. It is a historically constituted product of human social formations, and that it can change, and that the agent for changing that system is them and their class. If they're organized in a revolutionary manner, they can create a society where they are in control, where the masses of people are in control. Um, so, just to continue with the following part of the quote, which I think is important. This ridiculous theory that communists should not work in reactionary trade unions reveals with the utmost clarity the frivolous attitude of the left communists towards the question of influencing the masses and their misuse of clamor about the masses. If you want to help the masses and win the sympathy and support of the masses, you should not fear difficulties or pinpricks, chicanery, insults, and persecution from the leaders who, being opportunists and social democrats, are in most cases directly or indirectly connected with the bourgeoisie and the police, but most absolutely work wherever the masses are to be found. You must be capable of any sacrifice, of overcoming the greatest obstacles in order to carry on agitation and propaganda systematically, perseveringly, persistently, and patiently in those institutions, societies, and associations, even the most reactionary, in which proletarian or semi proletarian masses are to be found. The trade unions and workers' cooperatives are the very organizations in which the masses are to be found. I think that's it. It just basically repeats the same thing afterwards, but there we go.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we get at with the purity fetish too now. I mean, people probably the argument gets made less probably now at the trade unions, like we can't, work within reactionary trade unions. I don't really hear anyone saying that, but you do have this purity fetishism with Trump supporters being, sort of a basket of deplorables, or not talking to certain kinds of people who have certain ideas, or going to certain events where the masses might be, because those events are led by quote unquote bad guys. And sometimes they are reactionaries leading these events, but that's not the point. The point is, if the masses are there, go to them with revolutionary theory, go to them with the truth. And that includes reactionary trade movements, that might include political action like Rage Against the War Machine, whatever. The truckers protests in Canada. You know, you don't have to be 100% in line with the leadership and everyone there to go meet the working class people there. Or another example that does have to do with the trade unions. There were John Deere strikes in the area, huge historic John Deere strikes. The first time that John Deere, the workers, had gone on strike in, I don't know, like 20 years or something. And, you know, we went and stood on the picket lines, and it was Trump supporters there, of course. And they would tell us that openly. But did we disavow them and say, ew, you fascist scum, Trump supporter, I no longer support your labor strike? Like, of course not. You know, people are complicated. They have contradictions. So if you have this sense of purity with people, you're never going to get anywhere. So just go to where the workers are, support their struggle when they're struggling against the bosses, help reorient their consciousness towards class struggle and away from culture war nonsense. And yeah.
And that applies today to like going on media shows and stuff, because you know, go to where the masses are at is today has to be understood in another dimension, which is, you know, they might not be physically in a specific place, but if they're tuned in on their phone to like Joe Rogan, the masses are there. So if, say, Joe Rogan invites you to do a podcast with him, and you say no because he's done X, Y, or Z that I dislike in the past, you're doing the same mistake that Lenin was criticizing the ultra left, infantile communists for doing. And it's, you know, Tucker Carlson. He's despicable, but he has the largest following I think any media personality has in the country. I mean, his Twitter shows have been getting consistently around 100 million views. That's like a third of the fucking country. So if someone like that told you like, hey, come on my show to talk about X, Y, or Z, you have to go. Not because of Tucker himself, but because of the millions of workers that will be hearing your ideas by doing that. That's the equivalent of what Lenin says, going to where the masses are, except in our technological age. If the masses are there listening to Tucker Carlson and you get that invitation, you say yes because you want to reach the masses.
Exactly. Yeah, thankfully I haven't seen that. I mean, maybe it's just because of the people I follow now and I don't follow anymore, but it used to be like anytime someone went on Tucker Carlson, our Twitter feed would be filled with, he spoke to a fascist. Like, he spoke to someone who has the most popular cable media outlet in the country until he got fired. Why, as a socialist, would you not use that outlet to push socialist ideas? It's just so silly. But we've talked about this so much. There's a lot of people who like don't think about things strategically. It's almost like they don't want to win, or they're at least not thinking about winning, or about practical political organization. It's all, about idealism and having the most pure ideas in the online leftist social group.
Absolutely. Do you want to turn to our next segment? I think you were the one that brought this one up, or someone submitted the video for us to react to.
Yes, I'm quite excited for this one. You guys have made it through the highly educational part of the stream, led by Professor Carlos. Now we're moving on to the cult that many are in but don't realize. We're moving to deconstructing this nonsensical video, giving the people what they want, giving the masses entertainment, us combating other YouTube history channels. I've been on a vendetta lately against these YouTube history channels and gaming channels turned into history channels. We exposed recently, with the help of our buddy Volound, that the Kings and Generals gaming channel turned YouTube channel with 3 million subscribers is literally having their scripts written by the NED. And then they are connected to a network of other history channels through this thing called #ProjectUkraine. So it's all very, very sketchy, but this is just another one of these history channels putting out blatant propaganda and pretending that it's just objective. But they went really off the rails with this one called "The Cult Many Are In But Don't Realize," and it's about dialectical materialism. So, anything to say going in, Carlos? Do you think that this video will change our mind about dialectical materialism, and we'll leave the video thinking that we are in a cult, knowing that we are in a cult? Finally, having our eyes open to the cult.
I thought we were already cognizant of the fact that this was a cult. Um, I have a little Marx candle, and it's whenever we have a question, we go back to the sacred texts. It's a cult. We're in a cult.
It is. I
No,
pray
that's
to Noah every night.
yes, yeah.
All right, let's check this out. I can only imagine what kind of arguments we're about to hear.
The man behind the curtain is a priest. The curtain obscures the fact that what you're looking at is a religion, and everyone comes away thinking that it's a science. No, it's not. When you pull back the curtain, you're left with religion, and the curtain is called the dialectic. Dialectic is a process of obscuring the fact that you're dealing with a religion, and it's also the process of tricking you into believing in this religion.
I like how they're always trying to psychoanalyze people too. The liberals always think they're so much smarter than you, and they can tell you what you believe. That's something Noah notices all the time because he hates when rich liberals talk down to him. But it's always like psychoanalyzing people. No, you're just stupid and you're tricked into believing this religion. Yeah.
That's pretty. It just doesn't make any sense because, like, dialectics. There's no such thing as dialectics in general. There's like different forms of dialectics. You have like the Platonic dialectic, the Aristotelian dialectic, the Heraclitean dialectic. Those various dialectics within the scholastics. There was like classes that would be offered within scholastic curriculums on like dialectic, and for them it meant like the method of argumentation. It was grounded on the old school Platonic notion of dialectics as a series of arguments that progressively, I didn't say series, but a series of arguments that progressively advances to higher and higher forms. And there's a Hegelian dialectic, the Marxists. There's you go to Eastern philosophy, and there's various dialectics over there. The Taoist dialectic, which is similar to the Platonic in the sense that there's no negation of the negation, there's no progression, it's just constant contradiction contained within a repetitive process. And so, like, to say, as he just did, that like it's a religion, and when you peel behind, it's the dialectic. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, what entity of do you mean by dialectics? I mean, you could say dialectical materialism, and that the reference point then is Marxism, but that's like it's like talking about one form philosophy has taken that's in the vast majority of philosophers in history, and saying that that's all a religion. It's just when you really tease it out, it doesn't make any sense.
For sure. Well, we'll see if he makes it make sense here for us.
Now, the Marxists will screech and say that Tick doesn't understand because Karl Marx said in Das Kapital that it's not a religion. They don't believe in gods and they are purely material. But it is a religion. And I don't care what the curtain says. It's a religion, and I'm going to prove it. But it's not just Marx, it's Mosley, Mussolini, and Hitler as well. They all believe in this religion, and they all use the dialectic to...
Hitler, the famous dialectical materialist. Bro, what the hell? What the hell? I don't even know. This guy's supposed to be a historian, right? He knows Hitler and Mussolini killed all the people we would consider scientific socialists. Dialectical materialists like Rosa Luxemburg, who I have on my bookshelf back there. You know who I don't have on my bookshelf? Or what I don't have? Mein Kampf or Mussolini's book on fascism. So it's not part of the dialectical materialist tradition. You dipshit.
And we should read it to know what these people were thinking. Gentile and all these. We should engage with their work. But it's completely absurd because if you know the history of fascism and the ideology and the judicature and just like where fascism took inspiration from, you see, as Lasordo points, that fascism is a product of the tradition of liberalism. There's nothing, when you analyze the history of liberalism, there's nothing, um, there's no breaks where one could point at and be like, oh, okay, that's incompatible with what then develops into fascism. It's always an ingrained component of that tradition, precisely because fascism is really just a form that capitalism takes in the moments of crisis, where the most reactionary and terroristic elements of the state come out in order to suppress the workers' movement, or to pull back democratic rights that have been won in previous decades for the sake of the profits of big business. That's all that fascism is. It's an operation that's always within capitalism, and it's got a relationship that resembles more, as Rocco has mentioned in his work on fascism, a now you see me, now you don't. It's like, it is capitalism taking a specific form in a specific time. So to compare that to equate that to communism and then have the bourgeois liberal tradition be disassociated is completely wrong. It's historically dishonest, and it's dangerous, because it fails to grasp what fascism actually is, and you're unable to understand what allowed fascism to develop, and you're unable to fight it if you don't understand it.
Precisely, brother. I had something else I was gonna say. I kind of forgot it though. I was gonna say, I think liberals have a religion. They worship Hannah Arendt and the origins of totalitarianism. And no matter how much evidence that they're shown to the contrary, they'll always conflate communism and fascism. Even at the time of World War II, when the communists were defeating the fascists and making great sacrifices to do so,
to obscure the fact that it is a religion. The Dialectic explains why, when you read their books, a lot of the time it sounds really strange. When you're reading Das Kapital or Mein Kampf, you're thinking, why has he written it like that? Why is he not using normal language?
Dude, what the fuck? He hasn't read the books, has he? Mein Kampf sucks. Okay, I'm sorry. It's not a well-written book. Like, you can say that Das Kapital is confusing, but it's this brilliant, logical, materialist exposition of like the development of different modes of production over time. Marx is extremely, and is notably so, extremely meticulous with his sources, right? Because he's drawing from material reality. He's drawing from what's known about the world. So what's so strange about that? I mean, yeah, the first 3 chapters are complex, but and then just to lump that in with Mein Kampf is, I mean, for anybody who's read this book, that line would make you laugh. But I mean, what the thing is his audience hasn't read these things. So you can just lump, Mein Kampf together with Das Kapital, and this lie has been repeated so many times that, the Nazis were socialists, and socialism and fascism are to be equated, or Marxism and fascism, that they can just say these things without any pushback. These just things that are completely absurd on their face.
Right. And what sort of standard for a set is he using? It's such an extremely broad standard, which is, this text is difficult. Why aren't they using quote unquote normal language? By that standard, like Russell's Principia Mathematica is in there with Hegel's Science of Logic, Marx's Capital, Mein Kampf, and Wittgenstein's Logical Investigations is in. It's like any text, like the vast majority of like thorough, rigorous scientific texts are like difficult to read, even if they're written by people who in other works they write very clearly in quotidian English. So like, how is that an argument? How is that something that makes sense when you're approaching this sort of grouping? Why all of these texts sound like they're not written normally. It's like, what the fuck?
What does that mean? I'm not a philosopher, but this seems philosophically incoherent too.
And the Dialectic explains it. Anyone who believes in the Dialectic writes really badly. And the reason why is because their objective is not to explain, it's to obscure. They are the curtain that pulls itself in front of the priest. So, in order to explain this, I have to remind you of what this religion is. James Lindsay has once again explained this brilliantly.
I mean, it's so not that, though. It's to go from the abstract into the concrete to confirm the abstract. You know, we come up with ideas. We test those ideas by looking at the material, or we look at the material, the concrete. We form ideas about it. We test those ideas by looking at the concrete again. We use that to change our ideas. There's nothing obscure about it. It's very simple. I mean, it can be summed up as the scientific method. You know, using our power of observation to determine our theory and determine what we know about the world. Nothing's being obscured. The goal is to get to the concrete, to understand the concrete as closely as possible, to approach truth as much as possible. So what's being obscured to you? You just don't want to see the truth. You're blinded by your liberal religion.
In a series of lectures on YouTube. I will post links to those lectures below. They are by far the best explanations I've seen of this, so I'm going to encourage you to watch them at the end of the video to get another perspective on this. So let's just start from the foundations. The faithful of this religion believe that there is a true God that's not material, it's not physical, it's purely spiritual. It's the absolute idea, or the spirit, or whatever you want to call it. But they also believe that there was a split in the heavens, and from this split you get shards of the true God cast into the ether. The demiurge, the devil, then creates the material realm.
This is not like, what is this guy doing? Like, how does this at all resemble Marxism, dialectical materialism? Not even in the slightest bit. And I'll take it even further. It has nothing to do with Hegelianism. It has nothing to do with Hegelianism. And you might toss out absolute idealism and however many key terms you want, but it doesn't mean that the substance is there. And this is not a new argument. Like, this is a very old argument. It's used against Marxism. It's used against Hegel. It's got a little bit more water in the case of Hegel because he uses religious metaphors constantly to explain what he's talking about. And it's hard unless you read unless you're competent in Hegel's philosophy, it's hard to understand how those function as metaphors and how there's a form of Christian atheism at work there. But it's just, it's not a new argument. It's the combination of two old arguments, which is that fascism and communism are conjoined, and that communism is a religion. All he's doing is mixing two old arguments that, I mean, even bourgeois scholars are not using anymore because they recognize how absurd it is. At most, they'll say, yeah, at times you could say that in the Soviet Union there was Marxism was treated as a religion, but it's just not even something that the most base bourgeois philosophers and thinkers are even arguing in anymore.
His description of Marxism sounds like a first-year philosophy student's like bad description of Hegel. Like if their professor just had him read it like one chapter and then say, "All right, what's Hegel about?" There's this divine spirit thing, and he talks about God. I don't know. It's just such a vulgarization and an oversimplification of dialectical materialism in order to argue against it and actually call it a religion, while himself completely misinterpreting the point of what Hegel was saying, and of course misinterpreting Marxism, which, yeah.
This world we inhabit as a prison for the shards of the true God. So if you think about the Matrix, we're all in this fantasy world that's not real, we just think it is, and Agent Smith, the demiurge, is trying to prevent us from realizing what we are.
The idea is that the world is real, that our ideas are just a reflection of the material reality, the real world. You didn't read the book. You didn't read the books, and then you made this public YouTube video claiming that you read the books, Mr. Tig History. And next time, if you want to be taken seriously as a historian or a philosopher, you need to read the books, because we've read the books and this video is incoherent. I'm sorry to tell you. I'm sure you worked hard on it and got paid much money by the NED.
We are God. We don't know we're God, but if we realize that we are, we will see the code in the matrix and win. But what this means is that the material world and every single one of us in it are shards of the idea, God. And God's purpose, our purpose, is to come back together as one and realize that we are God. In effect, God is trying to remember that he is God. So how do we remember that we're God? Well, the way we do that is through understanding, knowledge, divine gnosis, that God is non-material. He's therefore purely an idea, the idea. So we need knowledge, divine gnosis, of this idea. Hence, the religion is called Gnosticism, or maybe Hermeticism, which is similar. When we realize that we are God, that part is gnosis, and our pursuit of knowledge will lead us to the idea. So our objective is to acquire knowledge of God, Gnosticism. And how do we gain this knowledge of God? Through the dialectic. The dialectic presents itself as logic, it presents itself as a science. It is neither, it is alchemy, it is magic, it is nonsense.
This is such a half-assed understanding that combines some of Hegel, some of young Hegelians, and more crudely, I guess you would say Marxism. The idea is that there's the world is rational, and the world comes to know itself as rational in the process of human history, in human minds, which develop socially, which are in many ways conditioned by the material institutions in which people exist. That's what the zeitgeist, the spirits of the age, are in a way determined by, and by the trajectory, and that come to know itself precisely as this self movement. There is flirtation in Hegel with the usage of the image of God in similar ways, but it's not at all. With Hegel, it's a little bit trickier because there are some good arguments that you can make to say that it is a form of atheistic Christianity, and hence it's got somewhat of a religiosity to it. But it's not rooted in a correct understanding of how it is that this development takes place, and how it's grounded in material reality, and how if it was independent of that material reality, it would quite literally be empty, meaningless. It's this idea that you have the idea before matter, and then it externalizes itself. And yes, Hegel uses this language, but if you also look at how he describes the what this idea is before it externalizes itself, he's very clear that it's empty, it's meaningless. It only obtains meaning and content once it externalizes itself into nature and then into human history. And then the idea of that reconciliation of humanity realizing that it is itself God, that's basically the young Hegelians, and the most developed version of the young Hegelians, which is of course Feuerbach, who has this anthropological view of the necessary role that religion played, and the necessary role that this alienation of the human essence, which he sees as grounded in our ability to love, will, and reason, we alienate that unto God because we participate in that imperfectly, but we also hold the idea of perfect reason, love, and will. That is the only way we can make sense of when we love imperfectly, reason imperfectly, or will imperfectly. And we have the idea of perfection. We think that because we fail, that failure is grounded in the human species. So humans are imperfect at loving, reasoning, and willing. And so where is perfect reason, love, and will? Well, we have to create this figure of God. And of course, the Christian God is omnipotent, omniscient, and all-powerful, all-knowing, and omni-loving. So all-powerful, all-knowing, and all-loving. We alienate our essence, we externalize it into the figure of God, and then we're able to historically come to realize what we've done. And by adhering to Christianity, we're really adhering to our human essence in an alienated form. And the idea is just remove that unnecessary alienation and adhere to your human essence directly, which is a form of saying, well, instead of humans being created in the image of God, it's God that's created in the image of human. And the idea would be that what you treat as God now is really yourself. So there's that reconciliation involved, but it's all very half-assed mishmash of stuff that reads as if he just went off on a reading spree of spark notes of these different texts and just tried to develop a meta analysis of what the hell's going on in a way that's not coherent.
Right. Like, I like something that Noah always says: capitalism is a society that functions for capital. Socialism is a society that functions for itself. That doesn't mean humans become God, just because we have a society that works for humanity, rather than, by the anarchy of the market. But yeah, that's about all I have to add to that, except for I actually do think that I'm becoming God. Every time that I read Marx, I become closer to being an all-powerful, omnipresent being. So this guy had me pegged, but apparently not Carlos. It'd be fun to get you on like a debate stage with this guy. I know debates maybe aren't the best format for something like this, because these arguments take a long time to expound. But I skipped forward a little ahead. This is the most replayed part here. It looks like he talks about Stalin, and then I kind of want to get to the part where he talks about Marx, but we're not making it through this whole video. It's gobbledygook, and we're 8 minutes in. About
it's also, I think, important to ask the question of what is religion, because the answer to that question has changed historically, and although we feel like that answer goes back a very, very long time, that view is itself relatively recent. You can ground it in around the 19th century, and everything that's derived from that view. So, like the antagonism of religion and science is something that's fairly recent. Around the 19th century is when you can pin it to. And what ends up happening is that people just project this backwards. So, like, we have this idea that's fairly common in philosophy that, the first philosophers were scientists that moved away from the religious and religiosity of the Greek myths, and they sought natural explanations, and that's why they were scientists. But in reality, it was a mishmash of both things. And even like the most, what we would call scientifically minded of the Greek philosophers that were concerned with like healing and medicine, they would mix the spiritual stuff with, and the mythical stuff with, the more materialist or naturalistic stuff. So there's never been that very clear-cut division between like what religion is and what science is that is implied in these discourses, which are really grounded on a projection backwards of an understanding that's relatively recent, the last 200-300 years. And if you actually look at what like religion and science meant back in the day, they were forms of virtue. There were modes of life. You lived a religious form of life, which meant a specific thing. You lived a scientific mode of life, which meant a specific thing. And they were not at all seen as mutually exclusive. On the contrary, like in order to live fulfilling and comprehensive, virtuous human life, these were seen as virtues that you ought to take upon: the religious virtue and the scientific virtue, the philosophical virtue. And so that's another thing that we have to be careful of, how it is that the categories that we have today and how we understand them and the relationship to other categories of different forms of thinking, how we project that backwards, I think ends up leading to confusion quite often.
Is destroy mankind. Communism didn't fail in Cambodia. It succeeded. And the death toll shows that. They want.
Please read Reagan's piece about Cambodia, based on, it's a review of Philip Short's book, where he says the exact opposite of that. That clearly the Cambodians, the Khmer Rouge, did not understand Marxism. The leadership admittedly didn't understand Marxism. They were quoted as saying the big thick words of Marx, they were too long for us. Basically what they did was use the popularity of Marxism, almost, like a super vulgar, almost religious form of Marxism, like what this guy's trying to portray Marxism as, in order to mobilize people. And eventually they were taken out by Vietnam and the actual communists. So here you go. Here's the book. This is a great read. So Again, him misconstruing, taking, who was probably a CIA-backed leader in Pol Pot. There's, great evidence that the Khmer Rouge was backed by the CIA too, saying this is what Marxists are, when Marxists, even, Marxist-Leninists like us who support existing socialist projects have completely disavowed, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia and recognized them as non-Marxists, and, people who didn't understand dialectical materialism because they themselves admitted they didn't understand dialectical materialism. They understood dialectical materialism about as much as Hitler. So at least this guy's consistent.
On to accelerate the process of the end of history. So they introduce the state police, gulags, mass starvation. These things are part of the process, not a mistake. This is where I disagree with James Lindsay, who said these things were mistakes. But by reading someone like Stalin, their intent becomes obvious.
What the fuck are you talking about? When you read Stalin, you realize people like you are full of shit. Because you realize he's not talking about purposefully starving or mass murdering anyone. Even if you go deep into the Soviet archives and study what he was talking about during the so-called Holodomor, there was never any intentional starvation. And, in fact, there was great debate within the Chinese Communist Party and the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party in the Soviet Union about how to best go about combating famines and how to best go about collectivizing agriculture in a way that no one would starve, because if you allow too many people to starve, you can't consolidate support of the people, and they're just going to toss your government out. And it's going to be really easy for imperialism and the capitalist infiltrators to prey on the internal contradictions in your country and foment the coup or color revolution. Really easy.
Right. And first of all, there were famines of these sorts in virtually every place in the world that was poor. It was something that was common to poor countries and more specifically imperialized countries. Russia wasn't an imperialized country, but it was the weakest link of the imperialist chain. But what's always ignored is that famines were literally abolished in that area when they kept on in other non-socialist areas for decades and decades and decades. And those famines are ignored because those deaths cannot be politicized in order to critique communism and spin an anti-communist narrative. So, yeah, there's a famine. Many factors contribute to it, some natural, some artificial, the actions of the kulaks. But then you get that famine and you blame it all on Stalin and the Communist Party and on communism. And you ignore the fact that in this area that was famine prone, that had frequent famines basically every decade, that never happened again, thanks to precisely the collectivization and the industrialization policies of the Stalinist 5-year plans. It's kind of crazy. What's emphasized is like the one thing that was kind of bound to happen and that was forever abolished after that, and not anything else. They never talk about the hunger that came back to Russia and post-Soviet states during the shock doctrine, where hundreds of thousands of people died. That's never discussed at all.
Right. And I like how they say too, like, Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge brought prisons and police to Cambodia. Like, there weren't armed forces in Cambodia before that, or there weren't prisons. But they used the word gulag, and that's this big scare word, even though, as Noah has explained, like, gulags were extremely common at the time. The Soviet prison system was actually seen as progressive at the time because it taught, rehabilitated criminals, aimed to give them jobs, a place in the labor force, and actually paid them a minimum wage. And then guess which country didn't abolish labor camps, and which has this giant system of incarceration where prison labor is done for under $1 an hour to this day? That would be the capitalist United States.
5 main types of relations of production are known to history: primitive communal, slave, feudal, capitalist, and socialist. So we were all frolicking free.
That evil bastard! How he named modes of production! I knew he ate all the grain in Ukraine and forced those people to starve. Shit, this guy proved that he was right.
the Garden of Eden during primitive communism. Then we had the fall, and all became slaves.
The Garden of Eden during primitive it's like I can't stop the video fast enough. No, primitive communism wasn't the Garden of Eden. It was a mode of production where they shared communally. And yes, it had benefits, things that, you could consider better compared to nowadays. But they didn't have the same technological advancements. They didn't have the same control over production. So they were completely at the whims of nature. And what socialism and communism allow us to do is, go back to a classless society like what they had before, but with the power and control over production and, the earth that we have today, that allows us to have freedom from material want. Where in those primitive communist societies, there were, things that we did, like I said, that were better than what we do today or less exploitative when it came to relations within the class or relations within the society. But they were still at the whims of nature and the seasons and the weather and, the hunting grounds, and disease was rampant, right? The Marxists are very clear that the advancement of production, the advancement of technology leads to freedom from material want and leads to a bettering of material conditions. So to act like their view of primitive communism was that it was just this Garden of Eden, like, come on, do a little bit of reading, be a little bit intellectually honest. You guys suck, you freaking mega mind looking ass. Sorry.
And to be fair, we do have criticisms of that section from the textbook that's printed as Dialectical and Historical Materialism. Noah's going to be covering it next Tuesday. I think the first class was this Tuesday. The second one on historical materialism is next Tuesday. But I have my critiques of that text in the dialectics section. It's somewhat mechanistic. It's missing a central dialectical law, which is the negation of the negation, Aufhebung. It's got its flaws in the historical materialism section. It's got this linear view of history that's true for Europe, which is what Marx was analyzing historically, but that's perhaps not true for other parts of the world. And Marx came to realize that at the end of his life, after looking at anthropological and ethnological studies of other societies in America and India and in other parts of the world. So there is something to be criticized in that very linear historical materialist narrative and the way that linear character is then universalized for all of history. But the criticism is not the part where we return to socialism. The criticism is primarily on the part where you think about, well, what other modes of production have existed? Can we really label like the mode of production in India feudal? The one that existed, can we label it feudal, or are we exporting a category from Western Europe up to another place? The reality is that capitalism has to globalize, and so it makes the whole world capitalist, and it creates in the whole world the conditions for socialism. So those last two stages, capitalism and socialism, are true and have been proven true universally because of capitalism's universal character. So it's not like these texts are perfect, and they're not meant to be perfect. They're meant to be like an elementary introduction so that people can learn the basics and then develop from that a more concrete understanding of historical materialism or of the dialectic. And he's doing the same thing that the Western Marxists do, which is they take this very introductory pamphlet that's like 36 pages, and they say, this is Soviet Marxism, and I will prove to you why it's so backwards and vulgar and mechanistic. It's ridiculous. It's like rejecting evolutionary theory because a second grade textbook on Darwin or chapter on Darwin is like simplistic or simplified. It's absurd. The process of learning is a dialectical process that is a process that requires time for people to concretize and for them to achieve higher forms of knowledge. And you can't give someone Ilyenkov when they've never read the history of philosophy and expect them to know what the hell is being said. But you can start them off with the Soviet manuals or with Stalin's textbook, and they begin to grasp things and begin to be capable of grasping things that are perhaps a little bit more profound and richer and complex in content. And then that keeps going, and eventually they can read Hegel and understand what the hell is being said. But it's a process. And to pick the simplest, most elementary point of that and treat it as if it's the most developed form of that sort of thought is just intellectually dishonest.
I just love how he said Marxists are evil and they purposefully starve people. And it becomes really clear when you read Stalin. And it's just Stalin being like, here are the modes of production throughout history. Like, where in that is he saying he wants to intentionally starve people? It just went right over like this guy's head here.
But we've started to free ourselves, going from slavery to feudalism and feudalism to capitalism. We were, at least up to a point, getting freer. But what's the aim of the communists? To get us back to communism, to send us back to the Garden of Eden. So how are they going to do that?
No, dude, I explained that before you even made your argument. That's how stupid this is. I could see exactly where it was going. No, the idea is now that we have control over production. We have advancement in the productive forces, which is the material place. The place or the role in history that capitalism plays that creates fertile grounds, as Carlos would say, for socialism to come about. It's the negation of the negation. You have, primitive communism at first, then it develops into class society because of advancements in the means of production and technology. And then you have the ability to go back to a classless society, but with that freedom from material one, with that control over production. So again, whoosh, right over this guy's head, missed the entire point. He was too busy reading in what he wanted Stalin to be saying about being an evil dictator who wants to return society to this primitive state and starve everybody, that he missed the entire point of what Stalin's trying to say in this book.
I'm jumping to the conclusion without giving people the sort of argumentative premises that allow us to make that conclusion. Because it is true that we say primitive communism, class society, after we develop the forces of production in class society, it gets to a point where class relations themselves become a fetter, specifically in their capitalist form, and you have a higher form of communism, the historical negation of the negation, as you correctly pointed at. But there's a whole series of arguments that precede that conclusion, specifically grounded on a very scientific understanding of capitalist class society and why it creates the conditions for the possibility of socialism, why within capitalism itself you have the potential for the development of socialism. And if you're looking at this as a rational observer, you realize that it gets to a point where inevitably human will, here's the Hegelian cunning of reason, human individual wills will align with the will of history, and people will go on and fight for socialism and win. So it's inevitable, but it's also got human will in it. It's both freedom and determination. But it's very clear. I think I gave the story. The last day of class this semester, maybe a couple months ago or a month ago, I was talking with one of my students, a non-traditional student, 40-something-year-old fella. And he was telling me about his job and how things were difficult, and they're having to throw away what they produce because people wouldn't buy it. And the question that kept on marinating in his head was, why is such an irrational occurrence taking place? And it's not the first time in his life that it's taking place. Why does it always take place every 5, 6, 7, 8 years? And Marxism has the answer for that. And the bourgeoisie accept it. They accept the crisis-prone character of capitalism. They might reject the conclusion that it's grounded on that contradiction that's present in the commodity form that then manifests itself in all of these contradictions, and that's what's called the general crisis. But the bourgeoisie has had to come to accept it and to bring a veneer of a different form of analysis, to not use that to condemn the system as a whole. And it became very clear to the student that I was talking to that the only rational way to overcome these irrationalities that the system continuously bumps itself into would be to have the people that produce control and produce for the sake of meeting needs and not for the sake of profit. It's a very rational solution. And what would that entail? A classless society, or the development towards a classless society. And what would that classless society be? Well, the same communism, the same relations that we saw before class society, except now with the advanced productive forces, abundance that allows us to develop in ways that are much more limitless than what we had previously. Um, it just makes sense. And it's not a religious, prophetic thing. It's just grounded on a very serious and rigorous scientific study of capitalist political economy. And that's missing when he just says primitive communism, class society, communism.
Well, it stands to reason if we were freeing ourselves as we were going forward through history, then to go back through history, we'd have to do the opposite. We'd have to be enslaved. So first, they'll implement a totalitarian socialist state, then we'll...
I've never heard that. Made me legitimately laugh. I wish I had my mic on. I've never heard this argument before. Here. I've never heard anyone say that Stalin wants to reverse the dialectic and go back through history, through slavery, back into primitive communism. He just wants to put it in reverse, Terry. Like, what the hell is this guy talking about, man? Just pulling it all out of his patukas.
Oh, my God.
We'll have the rapture, and the state will wither away at the end of history. But of course, mankind will wither away along with it. And the survivors, the priests of the cult, will end up back in primitive communism. They'll end up back in the Garden of Eden and close to God again.
No, dude, the reason it's called primitive communism, it's because it's the old version. It's the old version of a classless society. It's not returning to primitive communism. It's called that because they didn't have advanced productive forces like we have today.
Can I just, for the listeners, because this is fucking hilarious,
Yeah.
what you just said.
Put it, yeah.
Hold the hand, Chico.
This is Stalin right here.
Hey, hold on, hold.
Lighting the revolution.
Oh, my God.
You got two cars coming two different ways. Here you go there. Bag up, Terry. Put it in reverse, Terry. Put it in reverse. Oh, Lord, Jesus. Oh, Lord. Oh, Jesus. What you doing, Terry? Terry, what you
Put it in reverse, Terry.
That's communism.
Yep. Right there.
It's all nonsense. The objective is not to bring about paradise for everyone, it's to bring a return to paradise for the priests only, because they know there's only so much room in the Garden of Eden. So the deaths and starvation in the camps are all part of the process of accelerating the destruction of society. In broad outline, the Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production may be designated as epochs, marking progress in the economic development of society. The bourgeois mode of production is the last antagonistic form of the social process of production. But the productive forces developing within bourgeois society create also the material conditions for a solution of this antagonism.
It's so genius, dude. It's so, I love even just short paragraphs from Marx. Like, they're so dense, so filled with information. And talking about how the existing modes of production came about from advancements in the materials of production, the means of production. And how, you know, the bourgeois mode of production is an advance in history, a progressive step forward in history. And like, there's no better example of that than, say, the French Revolution or the Civil War, you know, which were basically bourgeois revolutions, allowed the bourgeoisie to establish itself as the ruling class. But of course, there's going to be an antagonism within this new system, and that's between the proletariat and the bourgeoisie, which is also advanced by advancements in the productive forces, which causes capitalism and capitalist relations to become a fetter on production. It's just, Marx is not a god. None of us are saying he's a god, but an extremely intelligent man and an extremely poignant thinker who, yeah, I wish this guy would pay more attention to what he's reading right now.
I wonder where he's going to take this, because he's basically implying this very like if he said this of like a section of like the Radlibs, it makes sense. It seems like all they want to do is just tear down stuff and not construct anything new in its place. Just break everything and just tear stuff down, and there's no program for like rebuilding. And but the communist is the complete opposite. Like we're very much in line with the Enlightenment idea of progress. We're in line with the idea of the progressive development of the productive forces, not to the point of just like producing more waste as capitalism does, but producing more efficiently to meet the needs of humanity. Um, so it's definitely a project of like destroying for the sake of constructing something new. And that which you're destroying is in part that which fetters the construction, the creative construction of something new, that which prevents the flowering of like human potential as a whole. So it's not like this obsession with tearing down and violence and bringing institute. It's that's only seen as like one component of what's actually desired, which is a radically more free society, where there's abundance in the sense of not having, um, you know, um, having the necessaries of life covered to the extent that you can live a flourishing life in whatever area it is that you want to flourish in. Um, to paint this as a sort of leftist picture of just tearing down, it's just um, it's topsy turvy. It's the opposite of what it actually is.
The Twilight Zone world.
The prehistory of human society, accordingly, closes with this social formation. Let's just put that in plain language, because he doesn't speak normal. He thinks that history...
What's not normal about that? They clearly, he's just defining what prehistory is. There's a whole study of the field of prehistory. Engels wrote a whole book on it. That's what Origins is. I just hate these pseudo-intellectuals, man. Driving me crazy.
And there is here not a break, but a spin on Hegel, because for Hegel, history is tied to the development of the concept of freedom. And so you have in the East the idea that one is free. You have in certain parts of the West and Greece the idea that some are free, and that's why you have those slave democracies. And then you have in the Germanic world and Rome and stuff, and Christianity, the idea that all are free. And that's grounded on his idea of the end of history. People treat it in a very Fukuyama sense, like now no historical event's going to take place. There's no changes that are going to take place. But his understanding is that, well, the concept of freedom has developed to the point where now we have the idea that all men are free. And you're seeing this idea enshrined in bourgeois constitution after bourgeois constitution. It's not actualized, which is a critique that that we would give, that it's bourgeois freedom that is actualized, not genuine human freedom. But that's how he's thinking about it. And so history is tied to freedom. But if we see that, if we see freedom from the standpoint of actual freedom, from the people's self-consciousness of their limitations and the ability to transform their limitations and that which determines them according to their will, and awareness of necessity, in other words, and this comes from the Spinozist Hegelian tradition. If you see it from that standpoint, that freedom really only starts when you have socialism. And so that which is, if you're looking at history from the standpoint of freedom, as Hegel was, then for us, history starts with socialism. Everything else is prehistory. But for Hegel, the idea of freedom is sufficient to account for history, and therefore class society, because it's had various moments of developing the concept of freedom, is history. For us, again, freedom is understood from its actualization into the world, the combination of essence and existence. Are people actually free? And people will actually genuinely be free in socialism, and therefore that's the beginning of history for us. Everything else is prehistory.
I love how he completely misses the point of what these thinkers are saying right over his head. And He just dismisses it as them talking weird. Like, no, dude, you just don't get it.
Hasn't
Can
yet.
I say something real quick? Because this is a very important point from Marius. And I think you know where I'm going to get at, which is a rejection of enlightenment. Marxism is both a critique of enlightenment, but it is a constructive critique. That means that it is for me at least, the highest moment in the project of the Enlightenment, which is grounded in the faith and the acceptance of human reason, universal human reason, of historical progress, of a concept of universal humanity, right? And so what you have today in various forms, whether it's the woke form, which is very much grounded in a dismissal of reason or a nominal understanding of reasons. Well, reason is not universal. You have your European reason, which is bad, and there's other forms of reason and other forms of knowledge, which is a form of irrationalism. Lukács would consider it a form of irrationalism. You have that with the wokes. You also have the rejection of historical progress and the rejection of this universal concept of man. There's always different people, and they're defined not by this common character of being human beings, but by their accidental properties of being X, Y, or Z identity. That's why, wokeism is usually conjoined with identity politics. Philosophically, what are they rooted in? Well, they're rooted in Foucault. All those ideas are in Foucault. And where is Foucault bringing those ideas out of? Heidegger and Schmitt. And where are those ideas themselves being developed out of, and what resembles those ideas? Well, the irrationalist turn that the bourgeoisie takes after 1848, once it can no longer define itself as a revolutionary class, at least in Europe. After the 1848 failed revolutions, you have the transition from like Hegel being the bourgeois philosopher representing the progressive bourgeoisie, the faith in reason and progress and historical development and a common humanity. You have the transition from that to Schopenhauer. And then you have Nietzsche. And then you have this whole series of irrationalist bourgeois philosophers. So what you have with the wokes, with woke thinking, is precisely that, a turn towards tribalism, the rejection of the universal conception of man, the rejection of the idea of universal reason, the rejection of the idea of universal progress. That's why they reject in part Marxism, because Marxism is the most advanced and concrete form of that tradition. But then what do you have with the other side? The other side that's acting as a mirror of wokeism, you have precisely the same thing. There's certain tendencies now to turn towards Heidegger. What does that turn entail? It entails a turn towards philosophical foundations, which are the same as the wokes. And this is a point that we've brought up in various other streams, which is how the philosophical foundation of woke thought is little different from conservative reactionary philosophies of the past, which all rejected the Enlightenment understanding of a universal humanity, of universal reason, and of historical progress, that considered their historical forms of life to be eternal, a specific class of people, rich white men or whatever, to be, the most advanced form of humanity, the hierarchically highest, richest form of humanity, and everyone else to just be lower. So when you have this turn in the name of criticizing wokeism towards philosophical foundations which are the same as wokeism, that are grounded in the critique of modernism and the critique of the Enlightenment, and not its sublation in the form that it takes in Marxism, all you're doing is allowing the same philosophy which produces wokeism to enter into your so-called Marxism. And so it's impotent in criticizing wokeism or anything like identity politics. It's fully impotent because it's appealing to the same philosophical foundations as those which ground wokeism, which is anti-reason, anti-historical progress, anti the universal category of man. Man is dead. That's Foucault's one of Foucault's central dictums. It's found in Schmitt. It's found in Heidegger. So this is important to bring up. I think it was Marius who who brought it up. It's a critique of liberalism, but it's not it's a form of a progressive critique of the Enlightenment and of modernity, a critique that takes it to its rational conclusions, that takes its kernel to its rational conclusions, and not fully condemns and rejects it. Which, in doing so, it's perpetuating the form of life that allowed the rise of the Enlightenment, which is capitalism.
Thinks that history hasn't yet started. The prehistory of human society is the current era we are living in now, because we haven't developed the true socialist society. We haven't got to God, so history hasn't even started yet. It's total nonsense. History is the study of the records of the past. It has nothing to do with the formation of some mystical society. Just imagine how demented a mind you...
You're muted.
So what you were saying earlier, you were saying class societies and bourgeois society inherently results in philosophical irrationalism, right? That was one of the things that you just mentioned there. So it's not that humans are getting closer to, or like he's saying that there's some real God that Marxists believe in, you know, and trying to get closer to God, when the idea is you just remove this irrationalism, when you remove this contradiction from the core of society. Am I right?
Right, and he's talking about, he's using his understanding of the concept of history, which is quite literally just like telling events of the past, and using that to judge the standard of what Marx is saying when he means history and prehistory, which is completely different. The term history for Marx, as for Hegel, has a different concept that it is rooted in than for these people who are using the term but have a different concept, or have a different notion behind it. The notion of history for Marx, the reason why all history that we've had behind us is prehistory, and when we have socialism, we actually have the beginning of history, is because his understanding of history is tied to actual existing human freedom. I already explained this before with the difference between the Hegelian and the Marxist. So.
must have to come up with this nonsense. So now we understand their aims, we have to realize that the priests can't do this alone. They must convince people to join the cults before they destroy us all. And how do they do that? They trick them. Now, I've got to explain this. I was a socialist back in the day, but I wasn't a Marxist. I had a keen eye for history and understood that Cambodia, China, and the Soviet Union were bad. And
he pats himself on the back. I wasn't a Marxist. I had a keen eye for history. Like, yeah, we know you weren't a Marxist, buddy. We can tell you didn't actually do the readings.
Understood that communism had failed. I had read George Orwell, who is still my favorite fiction author, but I was misled into...
What else even needs to be said? What else needs to be said when your favorite author is an MI6 agent? I mean...
believing that the workers needed external help to save them from capitalism, and that help would come from the state. So I was a moderate socialist for practical reasons, and had never bought into the Marxist ideology. So
You're
I never...
a social democrat, then. You don't even know what the political labels are.
became a dialectic. I wasn't in the cult. Therefore, I can't explain why anyone would fall for this. I'm sure there are reasons why, and I'm hopeful that there will be an ex-dialectic somewhere in the comments who can explain to us how they got in it and what it's like to be, see the world from the point of view of a dialectic. But I can't...
What's that saying? Dialectics are like cocaine.
What?
The more you do, the more you want, or whatever. Once you start to learn dialectics, it changes the way that you see the world, and it helps you understand social phenomena, and it helps you understand the world that you're in and how to operate within that world, as sort of an actor in history. And you can kind of place yourself in the historical context. It's really helpful, and you want to look at everything that way, like China applying contradiction analysis to every aspect of society. And it's working well for them. I mean, these guys can say the failure of socialism all they want. When China's abolishing poverty and building high-speed rail connecting every center of economic power in their country, it's becoming harder and harder for these people to say that.
and in the post-Darwinian world, dialectics has already a footing in common sense. Most people realize that you cannot really understand something correctly if you separate it from the environment in which it operates. You need to understand a thing within its environment and the interconnections in which it exists. Most people also understand that really to get a grasp of something, it's not enough to just pick one moment of it and then pass judgments on that you have to see its development. I give the boxing example all the time. No one would trust a boxing judge that only saw the 12th round of a fight. They realize that in order to pass judgment correctly, they need to see the development of the 12 rounds. They need to see the whole fight. People realize that in order to pass judgment correctly on something, it's not good enough to just zero in on that. You have to see it in its context and its interconnection, the role that it plays in the whole, in a specific form of totality. People also realize that entities are not homogeneous, that there's conflicting and contradictory forces within things, and that those contradictions help determine the route that things end up taking. And there's a plethora of examples that can be given in nature, in society, and in human thought for these phenomena. And that's the basics of dialectics: movement, contradiction propelling that movement, keep an eye towards totality and towards constant interconnection. And really that's it in terms of the dialectical ontology, the claims that we say about the world. That's basically the premise of it. Then we develop upon that certain laws of change, certain ways that categories relate to each other, certain ways that we can come to know this world dialectically. We see it as a process of ascending from the abstract to the concrete, et cetera, et cetera. But that basic level of certain fundamental premises of dialectical thought, it's already almost common sense for the vast majority of people. People know that you understand the painting Bob Ross did better once you saw the whole process. Once you saw him ascend from the abstract canvas to the whole painting. They understand it better than if they just showed up and saw the painting. So it's a lot of these things are common sense. So to speak of dialectics as this mystified religion that you have to take a leap of faith in order to believe, and it's completely contrary to reason and empirical investigation, it's absurd. It's to show yourself for what you are, which is completely ignorant of that which you're talking to, I'm guessing, millions or hundreds of thousands of people about.
Dialectics makes more sense the more you apply it, the more that you use it to study the world. And like you can apply it to, like you said, common sense things that you already knew. Like one of my favorite wrestling coaches has this saying called "What you focus on expands." Right? That's like dialectics, because as you tarry with something, you begin to see it all-sidedly. You begin to see it in its totality rather than just in its isolation, rather than just seeing one particular part of a thing, and you come to understand it more fully. Based on its, internal contradictions and all the component parts that make up a thing. So, you can, once you understand dialectical materialism, or the more that you understand it, the more you can apply it to like little kernels of wisdom that you had been given in the past, or, experiences that you've had in the past. It helps you understand the world better. So also pretty interesting here, just a little Easter egg that I found. Look at who his source is on this Marx work. We have a contribution to the critique of political economy quoted from Garrido's Marxism and the dialectical materialist worldview. So, wow, we've really made it in the world. I got my copy of that right here. Carlos Garrido's Marxism and the dialectical materialist worldview is what this dude nitpicked and apparently he completely ignored the rest of the genius works of theory in this book that Carlos so meticulously and kindly put together for us to help us understand Marxism. It all went over Buddy's head, but I'll play it again. But pretty funny. You feel like you made it in this world, Carlos?
I don't know. That's pretty crazy, but it's such a widely available text that when you do scholarship, there's things that you can infer about people from where they're citing stuff from and what they pick to cite certain like widely available text. So like, you know that when you're citing capital, you should be citing the Penguin version because that's the version that people doing scholarship in that area are citing. Um, there's a million examples like that. When you see someone like quoting a very basic text from like someone else's source and quotes like that like I can literally point to like what part of the book it's in, you realize they don't know what the fuck they're talking about. So like there was no need to quote me. Just quote the fucking original source. The fact that he's quoting me kind of implies that he doesn't have a grounding in this tradition. Like I wouldn't quote me to find
Right.
quote that is a very basic quote that on a book that's been published a million times.
Right. Yeah,
But
I mean that makes perfect sense. I didn't even think about it that way, but it also makes sense. Like Cobra Commander says, this could be a targeted op against Midwestern Marks, and I always say that jokingly, but I talked about how the NED is writing the scripts for these groups like Kings and Generals, these big history accounts, how they're all have sketchy connections. A lot. I don't know if this guy specifically is connected to hashtag Project Ukraine, but that's really an umbrella of organizations in these accounts that stem from Kings and Generals, the NED account. And there are more groups like us who are pushing a dialectical materialist worldview, a scientific worldview, and that is the ultimate weapon in the hands of the proletariat, right? If they ignore someone like this and actually learn dialectical materialism, they're going to be a really, really tough revolutionary for the ruling class to defeat without killing them, right? So why wouldn't they be putting out videos like this, just discouraging people from even reading it, right? It's just gobbledygook. It's nonsense. Don't even read it. It's a religion. Everyone who tells you to read it is trapped in a cult. Meanwhile, I'm not going to engage with the actual arguments being made. I'm going to misconstrue them and straw man them and then make the video really long so you think I have some kind of authority. But yeah, I mean, like if any of the propaganda videos that we've broken down on the stream are targeted at us, this one is it. But I want to play the part here where he talks about thesis, antithesis, synthesis, it looks like, because I'm having so much fun listening to Carlos breaking down these deep philosophical concepts. I thought you were getting a little off track earlier with the wokeism thing, but it all tied back to the argument he was making. So I think this is a great philosophical learning lesson for all of us here.
Nobody can predict the future, and the fact that you think you can is an indication that you've fallen into a cult.
You can't predict the future. The building the future society is the work of history. It's the work of the future.
So it's time Red Pill. It's time.
Sorry.
We have agencies of people that go check buildings and that will tell you, if you don't get this fixed, this building is going to collapse. It doesn't take a magic 8-ball to see that when there's certain fissures in the structure of a building, that means that if things take their course, that building will likely fall. The architect that goes to check and that passes that judgment through that inspection, he's not a cult leader. He's just someone who has a concrete understanding of what he's looking at and is realizing that if things continue the route that they're going, the trajectory is this one. So that's all we're doing. We're looking at capitalism as a whole structure, as a mode of life. We're observing its contradictions, and we're saying if these contradictions continue the route that they're going, this is where it's going to end up. It's no different than when an inspector goes to check a building and sees that if there's certain cracks and certain things in the roof, and that, with wear and tear and if with this natural process, it might collapse. We're not saying like, when communist society gets here, there's going to be X amount of people in this population, and we're not doing what the utopians did, which is go very deep into details about what it is. We're just passing judgment on the basis of what we are observing after a rigorous scientific investigation of our current mode of life and where it is likely to be going because of the trajectory that it is already on. Like, the trajectory of capitalism has been to monopolize. It's already centralizing the forces of production, it's already socialized the forces of production. So is it irrational to say that this is heading towards the trajectory of, well, we had individual private property and individuals working. Then we had sustained the private property, but we socialized production. The trajectory seems to be that you are going to socialize the ownership of that socialized production, the accumulation of that socialized production. So, and if it's centralized, it's the conclusions are drawing themselves out as we analyze the system scientifically. So it's, to pretend that we're sitting here with an 8 ball and just imagining what the next society is going to be like, it's absurd.
That's such a right. The building of the next society is the work of the future and the work of history, like I said, and Marx is clear about that. But that analogy with the architect looking at the structure of a building that he knows is going to collapse is so true, and that's such a good example for anyone, because everyone living under capitalism knows it's a crisis-ridden system. It's an inherently unstable system. That's undeniable. Even in bourgeois economics, they have this concept of the business cycle. Right? They understand it's built into capitalism that it's going to incessantly break, and then it can recover. And a lot of bourgeois economics is about how do we maintain this system and keep it going and keep profit coming in when the business cycle takes its course. But that's just the bourgeoisie admitting that capitalism is an inherently crisis-ridden system and just trying to say, oh, it's just a feature. It's something that we have to deal with. No, this is a product of the system being unstable and a contradictory system of value production at its core. So that's how we can predict that the system is going to collapse. And, to the extent that socialists do predict the future, it's been people like Rosa Luxemburg saying socialism or barbarism, right? You could just have the whole building collapse in on us and we just, turn to violence, fascism, barbarism, fighting each other for resources and water and things like that. Or we could have socialism, an equitable society with a rational system of production.
And we've already seen this play out in other countries.
Yeah.
Like, we've already had the socialist revolution in other countries. Unless you're worse than Marxists, then say that's not real socialism. But we've already seen that destruction of the building plan out in other buildings. So it's not irrational for us to sit here and say it might happen in the other places that had similar conditions to what ended up happening in these places.
Right. It reminds me of someone got asked, I don't know who it was, but they got asked, has socialism worked in Cuba? They're like, well, did capitalism work in Cuba? Because socialism evolved out of capitalism in Cuba. You don't have capitalist imperialism in Cuba. You don't have socialism. It's something that emerged from the internal contradictions of capital, the collapse of capitalism, or the expansion of imperialism, and its tendency to super exploit other nations until people are ready for revolution. Right, to just say it didn't work is such a silly oversimplification that doesn't help us learn anything about the country or history.
And I want to bring up this quote from Althusser in 1953. He says, "Now, since the appearance of capital, the materialist conception of history is no longer a hypothesis, but a scientifically proven proposition." Like, you should just look at how, like, how historiography has changed after Marx. Now historians must at least give some semblance of a class analysis and an analysis of the material forces of society. They have to do that. That's why you can get, after Marx, certain bourgeois historians that their heart might not be with socialism, but they'll do good historiography. And anyone that's in the field of history and is a Marxist realizes that. You weren't getting that before Marx. Before Marx, you had the great men of history. Very rarely would you hear about economic forces and the role that they play in shaping other phenomena in society. So, in the same way that Marx's analysis of the crisis-prone character of capitalism and the polarization and the inequality, etc., has been accepted by the vast majority of bourgeois thinkers, the same way that even the theory of the state, like, what is the theory of the state of Marxism? Well, the state is an instrument of the ruling class. What are these recent studies from Ivy League universities saying about the American political system? That it literally only represents the big monopolists and the big lobbyists that basically control the whole political system. It's the same thing here with the analysis of history. even the worst of the bourgeois historians have to at least play a tongue-in-cheek tribute to a materialist conception of history in order to be taken seriously at all.
Yep. Shout out to Edward Baptiste with the half has never been told.
Mhm.
It's a great history from a non-Marxist thinker, as far as I know, that it's been really helpful in my research, because it just focuses on the economics of slavery, which then you take a look at it from the standpoint of production. If you start from there, it's so revealing about the political structures and the political antagonisms and what led the build up to the Civil War, which, you know, when you read it from more abstract or idealist historians, it's like you said, great man of history. It's Lincoln came along and led the North. And it's hard to, you know, I remember as a kid, like history didn't make that much sense to me. I'm like, yeah, but what are the motivations here? What really forces a revolutionary moment to happen? When you look at it from the standpoint of production, it's so revealing whether you consider yourself a Marxist or not. So there's a lot of badass materialist historians out there who aren't Marxists, because of that.
Wake up and get out of the matrix. We live, necessarily, in a society of continual and unending change. Change that can never be precisely charted in advance.
Hey, it's one of the laws of the dialectic. We finally got one. You finally said something that's true about the dialectic. And gave it to this guy. I don't know who Murray Rothbard is, actually. Do you?
I don't, but I can never be charted in advance. I mean, it depends on what you're talking about. I think that we can decipher certain laws of movement and interconnection, and it could help in our understanding of where things might end up. Um, you know, it's not a precise prediction, but there are observable laws in nature, society, and thinking uh, that are related to how things change and how they're interconnected to each other. You don't have once a new phenomenon occurs, you always have something of the old staying with it. And this was already in Aristotle, right? You know, Aristotle has substantial and accidental change. In substantial change, the form that the thing has is removed, but the matter is sustained in the new thing. The prime matter is sustained in the new thing it ends up being. In accidental change, you know, some material properties might transform, but the form, the thing as the type of thing it is, sustains. So change is always a process of sustaining something and removing something else. And that's a law of change. And it's not just Hegel and Marxism that postulated. There's a form that it takes in Aristotle. So insofar as that's a law, it gives us at least a certain ability to maybe not look into the future through like a glass ball, but to make certain predictions that are more likely than if we were just speculating without an understanding of these laws.
For sure. Otherwise, sports betting wouldn't be a thing.
But how are they thinking that they can predict the future? Well, what they say is, we have this thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and the synthesis is higher than the other two. This then becomes the next thesis.
Hold on. Where is it?
You suck! You suck!
Tired of seeing this Wikipedia-ass explanation of the dialectic.
There is yet another antithesis to this new thesis, and thus another synthesis again. And so what we're doing is constantly moving higher and higher and higher towards God. Hence the word progressivism, which is progress towards God. Now, it's progress into the land of Looneyville, West Virginia. And so we can't really call this progression.
It's a denial of progress too, like you said. They completely deny that there's any sort of historical progression or move to anything better, which is such like a depressing way to look at the world. You know, to think that we couldn't be moving towards a better and more rational society, as, you know, it denies the Enlightenment, exactly like you said, and the good parts of the Enlightenment. Fascinating.
at all. We've got a synthesis after synthesis, in other words, a wrong answer after wrong answer, building up on top of one another in a giant pyramid of stupidity, the state. And what we're left with is one giant stinking pile of dung. Nonetheless, they call this progress. No, it's nonsense. However, this nonsense allows them to say, okay, down the
I
line.
wonder what he aligns himself with politically, because that same rejection of progress is what the wokes do.
Mhm.
That's what the
Right,
wokes do.
I see
Oh,
that
how
now.
do
I see that's why you brought up wokeism earlier.
Right. And I mean, you look at Foucault, look at his treatment of the prisons. Yeah, you know, we're not tearing people apart with horses, but that panopticon boy, now we're dominating people's heads. That's much more profound. Where's progress there? It's like, what? There's a certain sense of, I mean, ask the prisoner that's getting torn apart. You can't. But I'm sure people would prefer, from getting torn apart in the middle of the village where everyone sees it, they would prefer like incarceration for a few years than getting fucking torn apart or getting their limbs chopped off in front of people. I think that's progress, but no, there's always a way to spin it into, oh no, it's actually more nefarious. You don't see it as a
Or
punishment, but you're actually self-regulating yourself and self-punishing yourself in this panopticon where you don't know when you're being looked at, so you just end up punishing and overseeing yourself and overseeing your own conduct, and it's so it's a rejection of progress, and then he does it too.
right. I want to say, or getting rid of chattel slavery or any of the huge, obviously progressive advancements have been made. It reminds me, actually, there was a video, like a BuzzFeed video a while back that they just got lambasted for, where they asked these college students, like, has America gotten any better since slavery? And a bunch, most of them said yes, but a bunch of these woke college students said nope. Like, it's just as bad now. It's like, what the hell are you talking about? What are you talking about? Go live in that time then. Like, jeez.
A big chunk of today's
and sorry, last thing, yeah, because I've forgotten, want to get it out. Even Hegel and Marx, they never say that progress is linear. It's just this train speeding forward, right? They're like, there can be 2 steps forward, 1 step back. There can be 1 step forward, 2 steps back, 3 steps forward. History doesn't just go zoom. It's a zigzag. I've heard it described that way.
Zigzag. Yeah, that's Lenin's quote, zigzag. Absolutely. And, the place that it's most clearly seen today in terms of this rejection of progress is how people undermine the civil rights revolution and the tremendous influence it's had in changing the forms of intercourse in our society, the forms of intercourse within civil society, the consciousness of the American people. And, it prevents them from actually understanding where the fuck we're at, and what's happened since 1965. But to get back to that, yeah, it's not this fatalistic view of history. Like, the problem is that these people, they lack dialectics, and so when they try to understand dialectics, they understand it very one-sidedly and undialectically, and in so doing, just completely distort everything. But both for Hegel and Marxism, and you go back and you have Spinoza as well, like, there's not freedom here and then necessity here, or determinism here, right? This bourgeois, it's not really, it's more than bourgeois, but it's this philosophical problem of freedom or free will and necessity, limitations to that will. It doesn't make too much sense in Hegel and Marxism and Spinoza, because freedom can never be divorced from the limitations to that freedom, and the limitations to that freedom, that which is determined, is always it always contains within it a component of will, and that's the same. Like, Hegel's idea is not that spirit is just moving blindly and just people are just going with it. Like, people align their specific individual wills in ways that are their own free will, but they don't realize that their free will, because they're conditioned by their society, aligns with the movement of history. He calls this phenomenon of the alignment of the individual will, freedom, with the universal movement of history, determinism. He calls this the cunning of reason. It's a dialectical unity of of freedom and determinism. And you have the same thing in a different, more concrete form in Marxism. And so when he's talking about this sort of thing where, freedom here, determinism there, and what are you doing? There's no will. There's no. That's bullshit. It's a projection of his absence of dialectical thinking.
Then this will happen, etc. And it's nothing more than a trick of the mind. It's a blatantly obvious fallacy. It's a trick, it's a trap, snake oil, an illusion. They are trapped.
He has to use all these descriptors to make up for his lack of argument. He said nonsense like 20 times, snake oil. I've heard people call the dialectic a word game. It's all an ability to, it's all an effort to express the dialectic as this simplistic, idealist, abstract thing with no connection to material reality, which is the opposite of what dialectical thinking is. It's like I said at the beginning of the video, like a first graders or a first year philosophy student's botched effort to explain what the dialectic is. Let's skip forward. Here it looks like he quotes Hitler, getting towards the end here, but this is so interesting for me to break down with you, Carlos. This video is a gold mine of poorly made philosophical arguments.
I'm still in awe that he fucking quotes me. It might be
that's crazy.
It made us anywhere from $8 to $20, depending on what version.
Nature, he doesn't mean nature, he means the dialectic, which he believes allows him to see the world correctly. Man has discovered in...
No, nature is the proof of dialectics, dummy. Not dialectics are the proof of nature. This is why Marx and Engels were so heavily studying anthropology, science, and mathematics at the end of their life, because they realized that the work of Darwin, Lewis Henry Morgan, and a lot of the mathematicians and scientists, as Engels writes in Dialectics of Nature, confirm dialectical philosophy and these laws about constant change and flux and the interpenetration of opposites. And Engels' anthropological analysis has been confirmed and confirmed and confirmed. There are small parts that are outdated, which is how a materialist analysis works. We change, certain things change as we gain more material knowledge about the world around us. But he was years ahead of his time, and what the theories he made in Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State have only been confirmed by more anthropological research with time. So it's the opposite. It's not, forcing nature into this word game of the dialectic. It's using the principles of dialectical materialism to look at these different fields and make advancements in them, like China's doing in every field. And, we have nonsense like this that our kids are being brainwashed with. China's applying contradiction analysis, and materially, in the way that both societies are developing and unfolding, we see the difference there. We see that China's just kicking our ass, and that's only going to continue. Our intellectual leaders being propped up by our ruling class are nothing but sophists.
And the most famous American paleontologist, Stephen Jay Gould, just because you mentioned anthropology, he has a famous quote where he's like, had anthropologists paid attention to Engels' writings, we would be 100 years ahead of time in our studies.
And Stephen Jay Gould's freaking amazing, by the way. He's got so many good quotes.
Nature, the dialectic, the wonderful notion of that almighty being whose law he worshipped. The full notion of that almighty being whose law he...
Notice how Hitler doesn't mention the dialectic, right? So he's saying this is what dialectical materialism is, and then taking a guy who killed dialectical materialists, a fascist, who doesn't even mention dialectics, nitpicking his work and saying this is what the dialectic is. Like, this is the most painful pseudo-intellectualism to watch.
I forget who it was, if it was Schmidt or Rosenberg, but one of the famous Nazi ideologues. He said when Hitler got into power, today Hegel died. But they're the best dialecticians in the world. I mean, get out of here.
I mean, what else needs to be said other than that?
Worships. Fundamentally, in everyone, there is the feeling for this Almighty, which we call God. That is to say, the dominion of natural laws, dialectic laws, throughout the whole universe.
He forces it in there himself. Just like I said, Hitler's not talking about the dialectics. He's like, this is what he means. Trust me. Sure he does, tick history. Sure he does, pal.
Yeah, the dialectic are these natural laws. The dialectic, according to these priests, is behind everything. God is the dialectic is God. For the Marxists, when the dialectic gets them to the end stage of history, they will have the new Soviet man, a super being known as the species being, which is what Karl Marx called it. For Hitler, this nature or dialectic is the one determining which race is going to dominate the world.
The Gattungswesen, the Gattungswesen is a concept from Feuerbach that Marx uses for maybe like up until 45 when he writes the German ideology with Engels. He never mentions anything about species being Gattungswesen in German ever again. Yeah, there's some kernels of that concept restated in other terms, but I mean, this is the sort of thing where when someone says something like that and you're ingrained in that tradition, you just understand that this is a person that has not read adequately to be doing a video like that.
Absolutely. I skipped forward a little bit. It looks like he delves into horseshoe theory a bit here.
National Socialists. It does vary depending on the particular person you're looking at and their brand of dialectic, but the principle remains the same. And here's the thing. When we look at the traditional political spectrum, you generally have communism on the left and capitalism on the right, supposedly. Obviously, I now reject this, but let's just go with it for the purposes of this video. Hitler and Mussolini, the Nazis and the fascists, do not like either communism or capitalism. They saw these as what? Thesis and antithesis. Therefore, they synthesized them together in a new position, a third position.
Mr. Madison, what you just said is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it. I award you no points, and may God have mercy on your soul.
That does it.
Yep. You know that the Nazis coined, or the term privatization was coined under the Nazis because they just sold off all their public industry, public firms to corporations who were helping fund the rise of the Third Reich and the paramilitary death squads that the Third Reich was sending out to kill dialectical materialists and communists like Rosa Luxemburg. It's just state violence to maintain capitalism in a time of crisis. And one of my favorite sayings about fascism is every fascist takeover is there's a failed socialist revolution, a failed communist revolution, because it's the use of violence by the capitalist ruling class to suppress the revolution in a time of crisis, like what Germany was in, profound economic crisis, and maintain the rule of capital. And to say they're just mixing communism and socialism because there's the government is doing stuff or whatever. I don't even know. I don't know. This is an embarrassing. I mean, in a society that made sense,
this is where
this would be an embarrassing video, right? It'd be someone who's clearly not read I think he considers himself a historian, but he's making a video about philosophy here, and he clearly hasn't read the subject matter. He's clearly nitpicked these quotes to make it look like this is a real intellectually honest and well-sourced video. When they're completely nitpick quotes that he's reading his own meaning into completely.
At least he's not American. It doesn't sound American, so he's not.
True.
He's not our
figure.
Yeah,
Right.
he doesn't represent the red, white, and blue boy.
the Brits got to get their shit together. I mean, he does represent the red, white, and blue in the UK.
That's such a weird thing to like describe a country, because like maybe half of the world's countries' flags are red, white, and blue. But you know what he's doing there is taking what, in the words of like Marx and Engels and the German ideologies, taking as true what men say about themselves at face value, and not what they are actually doing. So at face value, at the level of what they're saying about themselves, the Nazis are third positionist. They're beyond capitalism and socialism. Um, they take from one side, from another, etc., etc. That's the face value. That's the ideological manipulation needed to get working class people on board. In reality, it's just capitalism. It's just capitalism that rollbacks the democratic rights the working class had won, and that does so with impunity. That's it. That's basically it. It's the open terroristic dictatorship of the most developed segments of capital. Parts of the petty bourgeoisie go along with it. That's an accidental, not a necessary or an essential component. But it's it's just the most reactionary form that capitalism takes. It's when the repressive apparatuses are constantly there to smash any gains that were made by working people.
Facts. So yeah, that was Tick history. Definitely a fun one to break down there. Thanks to whoever sent that. Got a
I
couple
hope he
super
gets a
chats
tick.
here.
I hope he gets a tick and that he becomes history. No, I'm just joking.
How dare you? I had Lyme disease. I don't wish that upon anyone. Just kidding.
Every time I see a tick, I'm reminded of that.
Yep. Just watch out if you get the bullseye rash. That's when you're in trouble. Thank you so much for the super chats, Yazan Shobaki. These super chats are absolutely necessary to what we do here at Midwestern Marks. So thank you so much for funding the project with this. Opinions on the PFLP and George Habash. I don't know too much about the internal politics, specifically of Palestine. Obviously, we support the liberation of Palestine. Obviously, PFLP and their founder, George Habash, are a Marxist, anti-imperialist, or a Marxist-Leninist facing party. But it's not like I've been following it closely enough, and I certainly haven't been following the internal politics and debates of the party. But it sounds like they're critical of the PLO, which most of my friends who follow the Palestinian struggle closer than me seem to also be highly critical of the PLO. They just seem to think that the PLO is not what it once was. It's not what it used to be. And, it's been co-opted by the apartheid regime, the Zionist regime, and the imperialists. So, I imagine I probably would like this Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PFLP party, and George Habash, but not my area of expertise per se. Thank you so much for the super chat, though. We also got Lemonhead, Dylan Burns, right sector. All right, if Carlos isn't too tired, we'll watch some of that video because I've been promising you that we're going to react to that forever, and it's kind of goofy, but thank you so much, Lemonheads, consistent supporter of the show. Really appreciate the super chats. Carlos, I know it's late. Are you ready to turn it in for tonight, or do you want to watch Dylan Burns interview right sector for a little bit? You're muted.
How long is it?
It's long, but I don't plan to watch the whole thing.
Okay, I'll watch it.
I was gonna say no because I'm tired, but Lemonheads has been sending us super chats and asking forever. And I did start watching this video the other day, and it's pretty interesting and funny. So this is what sending super chats consistently gets you. We'll stay up till 1 a.m. to answer your requests. Thank you, Lemonheads. We do appreciate the support. The teaser. Should we skip the teaser? Yeah, here we go.
Fantastic. I would like to start with an introduction.
If you need background information, Dylan Burns is just like a teenage shill for Ukraine who's been doing war tourism all around the country and promoting the NATO State Department line on Ukraine. So he sucks. He also looks like Hagrid.
His name, his role, like what his job is in the military.
My name is Yaroslav. Most people in Ukraine know me as Aquila. Rudyard Kipling, you know. I am the commander of the scouting troops.
What part of Ukraine are you from? And what was it like growing up there?
What do you think he meant by Rudyard Kipling? Because he was an unapologetic colonialist and racist. Do you think it was just a coincidence that he brought him up, or?
I mean, could be. These people are so whitewashed in just quotidian society. Like we will watch the movies and not know any of the history, but it could be, could not be. I'm not sure.
Here.
Where Pilgrim says, I'm sure he's just a Disney fan.
What's that?
Where Pilgrim says, I'm sure he's just a Disney fan.
Dude just loves the Jungle Book.
Nazis like Mickey Mouse too, you know.
Are they really Nazis if they enjoy Mickey Mouse? Like,
that's the question.
Those things are really compatible.
Did you ever see
the positionist theory? Sorry, what?
Did you ever see the Will It Blend show?
Yeah, oh yeah, I've seen it like every episode.
Same thing. But the thing is, like, will it blend? That is the question. And are Nazis like Disney Nazi? That is the question. If you like the Jungle Book, you get a pass.
Right.
That's
Nazi smoke. Don't breathe this.
Normal childhood. A bit of a hooligan.
Was there any hobbies or ways you like to relax in Kiev?
I loved to go to the theatre. To the forest, hiking. I was teaching children how to survive in the forest, not to get lost.
What kind of shows did you like to see at the theater?
Performances.
Theater performances.
Got you. What was his job before working in the military?
The right sector guys, like, the hell kind of question is that, Dylan? You dipshit.
Financial security.
What job does he enjoy more? Financial security or working in the military?
Both are similar. It's just that one is on the front lines and another isn't. The skills and moral will.
That's an interesting way to describe being in finance. It's the same as being in the military. It's just now I'm on the front lines, whereas finance is pushing things from behind the scenes. It's a pretty dialectical, materialist way to look at it, to be honest with you.
Required for both are the same. In both cases, I got to do the thinking.
When did he first join the military and for what reason?
In 2014, because the war started.
When the war started in 2014, did it take him by surprise? Was he...
So Vaush defeated. The war started in 2014. Wasn't that one of the points of contention in our debate? He was saying it didn't start. There was just Russian separatists forming in 2014, and the liberal democratic Ukraine government was forced to crack down on them. Not that there was a war inspired by the right sector and Nazi takeover of the government after they hijacked the Maidan protests.
Expecting it?
No. We expected this war to happen for like 15 years. We expected it and we're training for it.
So he was training before.
Another Vaush argument destroyed. The Nazis in right sector weren't training in Ukraine, preparing to kill all these ethnic Russians. Literally, the Nazis in Ukraine. Yeah, we were. Yeah, we were preparing for 14 years. Like, the whitewashing of these people by these socialists like Vaush. It's out of control.
It's the same thing as when they try to diminish the role that they played in the 2014 coup. Like, there's literal videos of the leading Nazi members, like, saying, if we hadn't gone in there and led these protests with American weapons, it would have just been a gay pride parade or something. I don't know if you remember those videos. They were being shared around at the beginning of the SMOs. Like, the Nazis themselves, in taking pride at the role they as Nazis played in these things, are admitting or admitted the things that now the liberals, in order to justify their narrative, reject.
Right, and like he just said, they've been preparing for 14 years. As I pointed out in the Vouch debate 100 times, you have like Project Aerodynamic, where the U.S. has been propping up this ideology that this guy is a part of since the end of World War II, literally, and during World War II, when they were backing Bandera himself. But then you think when internal crisis pops off in the country and all of a sudden turns violent and these right-wing figures take over the government, like they had no part in that. You really don't think they hijacked Maidan? And you really don't think the U.S. had any part of it when they were funneling these guys millions of dollars? Like, you got to be so naive. And that's what Vaush was doing when I was explaining to him all these different factors that just point to a coup. He's like refusing to see the connection of Victoria Nuland admitting $200 million dumped into the country through NGOs. This guy saying they were preparing it since 2014. The CIA program that literally revealed documents that show the CIA had a program funneling money into groups like this. Like, how freaking dense do you got to be to not see it, dude?
Or the 2014 invasion.
Sorry, do you have something else?
No, I was going to say, according to his math, they've been preparing it since 1999. Because 2014 minus 15, that means that around 1999 they started the military preparations for the war that officially takes off in 2014. Quick maths.
And military tactics?
Yes, yes.
How did he train?
We were training with the people who knew the war is coming. If not tomorrow, then the day after that, or later.
Training with the people who knew the war was coming. You mean like NATO? These officials who wanted a proxy war since day one? Or the NATO-backed right-wing groups?
But it will come eventually. And the enemy will be Russia. But they will
and they were being trained by NATO, by the way, because this is another point that people always forget. They're like, but Ukraine never did join NATO. Yeah, but NATO was making their troops NATO interoperable. So, you know, there's no NATO military bases there per se, but they're taking these Ukrainian military personnel who after 2014 are right sector Azov battalion people like this, or 2016, whenever they actually became part of the Ukrainian National Guard, and training them up and amassing them right on the border of the Donbass to prepare for this giant attack. And then, you know, people say Russia was unprovoked still because Ukraine never actually joined NATO. Like, okay, but NATO's amassing a giant military force on the border. And, you know, Angela Merkel admitted that there was never going to be an effort for peace. It was always to amass U.S. military power. But Russia was unprovoked because Ukraine didn't actually join NATO. Like, again, it's just refusing to look at the facts of the situation and just deflect or fall back to Russia bad.
Take Crimea and Donbass away from us. And if it works out for them, they're going to try and take over Ukraine in its entirety. That training was mostly strike ball. Yes, strike ball is an opportunity to work on your tactical skills, to learn how to work with equipment. Aside from that, you can learn a lot of stuff. You can work on your inside the city shootout.
A surprise? Was there an expectation of more resistance?
The surprising bit was that they actually decided to start invading it. That was a surprise.
So this is just irresponsible journalism by Dylan Burns is all this is. You're giving a right sector person, an extreme far-right member of the Ukrainian military that started out as just a super far-right ethno-nationalist political party with its own paramilitary wing before they took power of the government and were actually filtered into the country's military. But he's giving you propaganda that justifies, you know, their massacring and artillery shelling of civilians in the Donbass region. And Dylan Burns is giving no pushback. He's not saying, you know, he's not asking about the vote in Crimea in 1991 that said they wanted to be independent. He's not asking about all the polls that show that in in 2014, the vast majority of Crimean people, or people living in Crimea, wanted to join Russia. He's not talking about the fact that there were already thousands of Russian military troops stationed in Crimea well before they voted to join Russia. He's just allowing this right sector ethno-nationalist to spew propaganda without pushback. He's letting a Nazi spew propaganda without pushback, or someone who's deeply connected and associated with Nazis and their ideology if he's not one himself. So shame on you, Dylan.
Why it was a surprise is this, because at that time, Russians were holding most of Ukraine's economy in their hands. The people were in every law enforcement agency. Their people.
And now who holds Ukraine's economy in their hands? Though that's gone under the radar, but the whole damn thing's been privatized and handed off to multinationals. Just like the Hitler's Germany that we were just talking about. What do you know? Fascist states tend to act alike.
And a sort of creeping occupation was already happening. So the surprise was that they chose to do it with military force. Unexpected that was, because it was illogical. And yes, we hoped there would be resistance. Why that resistance didn't happen, that's a big question. Why and who should be blamed for it? Because if the war truly started in Crimea, and there were enough forces and means, then maybe Donbass would not have happened, and maybe this war would not have happened as well.
Does he think that the Russians would have?
For sure. Let's skip here to cultural Marxism and Western liberalism.
Yeah.
I wanted to talk a little bit more about the ideology of right sector for a moment. On the first paragraph of the official right sector website, it describes the mission statement of the organization as Ukraine's liberation from both external, the Kremlin, and internal occupation of clan or oligarchic groups, as well as a struggle against imposition of extreme liberal cultural Marxist ideas upon Ukrainian society. Do you agree with the sentiment?
Yes.
He says, yeah, he agrees with that.
So I wanted to talk about the later half of that, because we hear a lot about the first half, but not much about the last half. Why do you identify with the later half of that statement?
We already lived with that, did not have a good time.
Yeah, but
70 years.
але я розумію, що він питає, тому що
It kind of reminds me of what you said earlier about the guy who was taking the Nazis based on what they called themselves, their own, what they said about themselves, and saying this is the truth, rather than looking at the role that they played historically, or the positions they've taken historically, or all the fascistic anti-Russian positions that right sector has taken over the years, like the language law and stuff like that. Thank you so much, Lucas, for the $2 super chat. Really, really appreciate that. Racking up the super chats now, late at night. Midwestern Marks late night. Thank you for that.
Marxism то окей, то понятно, а коммунизм ясно. А экстремальный либерализм, what is there in liberalism? Что там в либерализме?
What's that about?
I feel like this guy doesn't even know what they're talking about. They're like Marxism and extreme liberalism, like they're the same thing. For an East European, it's probably like, what the fuck are you guys talking about?
Тому що Запад це майже всі країни ліберальні.
Well, liberal, yeah. Reasonably liberal. It's not war yet. I am a soldier. I can talk about war and the enemy. This is not my field. But I can tell you my personal opinion.
Так, скажи, класно.
Those people who, back in the day, a long time ago, fought for rights in the West, they did the good thing. Those rights need to be fought for. Women's rights, colored people's rights. And then, when they achieved those rights and liberties, they, jobless, had nothing better to do than make up various oppressions out of thin air. I'm speaking about the West right now. So they are searching for these oppressions of their rights everywhere, found a job for themselves. As a result, they started defending people who did not ask to be defended, and impose their values on others. And currently, those neo-Marxists in disguise and neoliberals are making up problems with LGBTQ plus community.
So they're Jordan Petersonists. They just conflate liberalism and wokeism with neo-Marxism. Pretty standard talking point there. I'm sure he's been trained up to give a positive spin on, rights for colored people, as he says, women's liberation, LGBTQ issues. He knows what the West wants to hear. But he still does give that criticism there of neoliberalism or neo-Marxism. So just the most interesting thing about this is that Dylan Burns did an interview with a right sector guy and provided no pushback and asked no tough questions or critical questions, which shows the role that he plays. But yeah, there you go, Lemonheads. We finally did it. We finally tackled it. There wasn't too much substance in there worth tackling. Obviously, Dylan Burns isn't going to platform a right sector person who just says, you know, yeah, we're racist. Yeah, here are our anti-Russian goals. Here's how we bomb civilians in the Donbass. But he did say a few things like admitting the war started in 2014. And the biggest revelation to come out of that, in my opinion, is that he says, since 1999, we've been preparing and training for this and working with the people who knew the conflict was coming. And that he says Crimea was invaded with no evidence to. But we would expect them to say that. Yeah,
Absolutely.
Carlos?
I was just looking for the meme of the black kid that's he's in the street and he's like, motherfucker, you know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
And that's like him trying to describe cultural Marxism. But I couldn't find it. I don't even know how you go about looking up the meme. But yeah, more of the same. A few talking points there that show that even the Nazis admit part of the way that we talk about this conflict, and in doing so, show how the liberal whitewashing is wrong. But yeah.
Well, this was a great set of videos that we reacted to today. It was a great show. Thanks for joining me, Carlos. I'm glad that we could learn that this is Marxism. So thank you to Tick History for informing us that we're in a cult led by this man with a giant spoon, and that we thought we were advocating for ending hunger and homelessness and poverty, but we've actually been advocating for starving people by eating all their grain with a giant spoon. So thanks, Tick History. Just kidding. Thank you to the people. Oh, go ahead.
No, go.
I was going to say thank you to the people who sent us those videos. Really appreciate that. Thank you to all our super chatters. Appreciate you supporting this show. Check us out on Patreon, Midwestern Marks, or patreon.com/Midwestern Marks. Become a YouTube member, Twitch subscriber, whatever you want to do. We're all over the place. MidwesternMarks.com is our website. Marks Midwest on Twitter. Midwestern Marks on Instagram. Edward M. Liger on TikTok. Midwestern Marks on Rumble. I don't know. I think I've hit everything. Telegram. Follow us on Telegram, Midwestern Marks.
Yeah, thank you to all who watched. And just some updates. I will be starting my class on Marxism and the history of Western philosophy on the 5th of July, Wednesday the 5th of July. It's going to run for 8 weeks. It's part of the Midwestern Marx Institute Marxism School. We're going to have many classes. We're waiting to coordinate a date for 2 other classes. One of them is going to be Dr. Thomas Riggins' class on anti-Düring, which Lenin called the Handbook of Marxism, and another class from Professor Danny Shaw that's going to be on the state, the Marxist view of the state, and various historical revolutions that have occurred from the Russian to other Latin American revolutions, and it's going to be a very informative, I think 15-week long class. That one's going to be the actual length of a university class. But thank you to all who watched. Consider becoming a Patreon if you can, or a YouTube member. And do we want to go out with what's that song that Sam recommended twice? Forgetting the name.
I don't know which one you're referring to specifically.
The first one he ever recommended, the first one you ever played.
All buildings?
Yeah.
All right, let's do it. Do you want a different version of it?
I don't know. That I like that version.
I do too.
Unless you want another version, but
Nah, let's play the Max Gomez version. He's a G.
And it reminded me of this old folks song. I'd never played that. Someday, my baby, when I am a man, and others have taught me the best that they can, they'll sell me a suit and cut all my hair and send me to work in tall buildings. So it's goodbye to the sunshine, goodbye to the dew, goodbye to the flowers, and goodbye to you. I'm off to the subway, I must not be late. I'm going to work in tall buildings. So when I retire, my life is my own. I've paid all of my debts and it's time to come home and wonder what happened betwixt and between when I went to work in tall buildings. So it's goodbye to the sunshine, goodbye to the dew, goodbye to the flowers, and goodbye to you. I'm off to the subway, I must not be late. I'm going to work in tall buildings. So it's goodbye to the sunshine, goodbye to the dew, goodbye to the flowers, and goodbye to you. I'm off to the subway, I must not be late. Going to work in tall buildings. Yeah, I'm going to work in tall buildings. I'm going to work in tall buildings.